I am Clementine Helen, 32 years old. Last Saturday morning, 80 of Charleston's wealthiest socialites stood in my foyer holding velvet gift boxes and staring in polite horror at bare heart pine floorboards. My mother, Virginia, was hyperventilating in the corner beneath the only item left in my three-story estate, a gilded 18th century French mirror. She had planned a surprise 50th anniversary party for herself at my house without asking my permission. She expected me to fund it, clean it, and serve as the unpaid help for her elite friends. Instead, I hired a climate-controlled moving company on Friday night and extracted every single piece of furniture I owned. I was sitting on the second-floor piazza with a paper cup of black coffee, watching her pristine social facade crumble into dust. Before I tell you what my brother was secretly trying to sell in that empty living room and the forged document that tore my family apart, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Morning Revenge. Drop a comment telling me your age and let me know if you have ever had to set a hard boundary with your family. Now let me take you back 48 hours earlier to when the trap was actually set. I work as a historical conservation landscape architect and the director of the Botanical Gardens here in South Carolina. Charleston is a city where your home is not just a place to sleep, it is a stage to perform on. Prestige is everything. Social power is not exercised through loud arguments, but through polite smiles and the phrase, "bless your heart." I bought my historic French Quarter home as a ruin and spent 3 years restoring it with my own money. My parents, Virginia and Thomas, are ambitious climbers, desperately clinging to their fading status in the local elite. They view my hard-earned estate as a free venue for their vanity. They practically worship my older brother, Preston. He is the pampered golden child. They funded his endless failed business ventures with first-class flights and expensive dinners, always ready to write another check when he maxed out his credit cards. Meanwhile, they treated my challenging architectural career like a trivial gardening hobby, rolling their eyes when I talked about my grueling 80-hour work weeks. I learned a long time ago to stop expecting them to celebrate my success. You learn to protect your peace, focus on your savings account, and build your own life. But toxic family members always find a way to cross boundaries you thought were locked tight. Thursday afternoon, the coastal humidity was heavy. I was kneeling in the soil at the Botanical Gardens, reviewing irrigation blueprints against a row of dormant hydrangeas, when my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a group chat notification. Virginia had added 80 of her most prominent country club friends to a single thread. The message read, "Surprise! We are celebrating our 50th anniversary at Clementine's house this Saturday at 10 a.m. Bring gifts and an appetite. It is our little secret to her." The replies poured in immediately. Heart emojis, congratulations, and wealthy wives exclaiming how excited they were to finally see the inside of my famous renovation. I stared at the glowing screen. She copied me on the thread as an afterthought, ensuring I knew my role. It was a mandate disguised as Southern hospitality. In her mind, I was supposed to panic hire a luxury caterer, polish the silver, and stand by the door to take their coats. Any refusal would be deemed a social sin, framing me as the ungrateful daughter who ruined her parents' milestone anniversary in front of the entire town. For years, I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace. I had endured the backhanded compliments and the constant financial exploitation to avoid the inevitable guilt trips from my father. But something about this specific ambush felt wrong. Virginia had been dropping strange hints for weeks. She kept calling to ask for my Social Security number, claiming she needed to update some old archived insurance policies. And 2 weeks prior, Preston had stopped by my house unannounced. I caught him in the formal dining room taking detailed photographs of my custom crown molding, the antique fixtures, and the layout of the space. He claimed he was just admiring the craftsmanship, but his eyes were calculating. They were not just planning a party. They were setting up a stage for something else. I did not reply to the group chat. I did not call my father to argue, because arguing with Thomas only triggers his trademark evasive silence and blame shifting. Instead, I closed my blueprints and brushed the damp soil from my trousers. I felt a cold, clear focus settle over my mind. I dialed the direct line for a premium estate extraction company. I booked a crew of 12 men for Friday evening. I told the dispatcher I needed every rug, every painting, every dining chair, and every crystal chandelier packed and moved into a secure, climate-controlled vault by midnight. I told him to leave nothing but the toilet paper in the bathrooms and the large mirror in the foyer. Hanging up the phone, my hands were perfectly steady. The upcoming anniversary was no longer going to be a celebration of their fake wealth. I was going to give them the empty stage they deserved. The moving trucks arrived just as the Friday evening humidity began to break. I stood on the sidewalk and watched a team of 12 professional handlers step out of 3 climate-controlled vehicles. They wore crisp uniforms and carried themselves with the quiet efficiency of men who handled priceless artifacts for a living. I handed the crew foreman a digital tablet containing the itemized inventory of my entire life. I told him he had 6 hours to turn a 3-story historic French Quarter estate into a hollow wooden box. The extraction was a masterclass in methodical precision. There was no shouting, no careless tossing of boxes. The only sounds echoing through the grand hallways were the sharp tears of packing tape, the heavy thud of work boots on heart pine floorboards, and the rhythmic rolling of padded dollies. I watched them dismantle the curated sanctuary I had spent 3 years building. They rolled up the Persian rugs that I had sourced from estate sales. They wrapped the velvet settees in layers of protective plastic. They unhooked the crystal chandeliers, plunging the formal living spaces into stark shadows. Every time a room was emptied, the acoustics of the house shifted. The space grew colder, louder, more cavernous. I stood near the winding staircase as 4 men carefully maneuvered my 12-foot mahogany dining table through the front doors. It was a stunning piece of late 19th century craftsmanship, purchased with the bonus I earned after securing my first major architectural grant. Virginia had always loved that table. She loved to sit at the head of it during the holidays, pouring imported wine and soaking up the compliments of her guests, pretending my success was simply an extension of her excellent parenting. Watching the table disappear into the back of a moving truck triggered a memory so sharp it momentarily stole my breath. 5 years ago, I did not own mahogany. I did not own historic real estate. I was living in a cramped, drafty apartment on the outskirts of the city, eating instant noodles for dinner 3 nights a week. It was a freezing night in February, and I was sitting on a cheap mattress with a legal pad, trying to draft a check that would cover my monthly student loan payment without overdrawing my checking account. I was drowning in 6 figures of debt. My father, Thomas, had always claimed the stock market took a bad turn, insisting the family accounts were dry and forcing me to finance my own education. That exact same evening, while I was calculating whether I could afford to turn on my heating unit, Virginia and Thomas were across town hosting an event. It was Preston's engagement party. They had rented out the most exclusive country club in South Carolina. They paid for a live jazz band, ice sculptures, and an open bar serving top-shelf bourbon. The bill came out to $40,000. I knew the exact number because Virginia had bragged about it to my aunt on a phone call, ensuring I overheard the price tag. I had sat in the cold, scrolling through social media, watching videos of my brother holding up a glass of champagne in a custom-tailored suit. He had never held a steady job. He had failed out of 2 different degree programs, yet he was being celebrated like a conquering hero simply for existing. The gross disparity in how Preston and I were treated was not just a passing annoyance. It was a quiet, festering wound that defined our family dynamic. My parents viewed Preston as an extension of their legacy, a golden child whose mere presence required endless financial worship. I was viewed as a utility. My academic achievements, my grueling hours at the design firm, my eventual promotion to director of the Botanical Gardens, none of it earned their respect. It only earned their expectation. They believed my resources existed solely to subsidize their vanity. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the moving trucks secured their heavy metal doors and pulled away from the curb. I locked the front entrance and turned around. The house was unrecognizable. It was a barren, echoing shell. The moonlight spilled through the unadorned window panes, casting long, pale geometric shapes across the bare floorboards. There were no curtains to soften the light. There were no plush rugs to absorb the sound of my footsteps. If I spoke, my voice bounced off the plaster walls and returned to me a second later. I walked slowly through the ground floor, trailing my fingers along the custom crown molding. I should have felt devastated. I had just dismantled my dream home in the middle of the night. Instead, the physical exhaustion was entirely eclipsed by a thrilling, undeniable sense of autonomy. This empty house was a physical manifestation of a boundary. I was finally stripping away my family's unearned access to my sanctuary. They wanted a stage to perform their wealthy socialite routine, and I was taking away every single one of their props. I climbed the winding staircase to the second floor, my footsteps ringing out like gunshots in the silence. I retrieved the only items I had kept behind: a small overnight duffel bag, a thermos of black coffee, and a cheap aluminum folding chair I had purchased from a hardware store. I carried them out onto the second-story piazza overlooking the cobblestone street below. I unfolded the chair, sat down, and poured a cup of coffee. The air was crisp and carried the faint scent of salt water from the harbor. I sat in the darkness for hours, listening to the city sleep. My mind traced the invisible lines of the trap Preston and Virginia had set. Preston taking photos of my architecture, Virginia asking for my financial details. They were planning something far more sinister than a free party, and they needed 80 wealthy witnesses to watch it happen. But their entire scheme relied on one crucial element. They needed me to be the obedient, silent daughter who would smile for the cameras and keep the secret. They were about to meet a very different version of me. Slowly, the sky above the Cooper River began to shift. The inky blackness dissolved into deep purple, then a bruised indigo, before finally giving way to the brilliant, hazy gold of a Carolina morning. The mockingbirds began to sing in the palmetto trees. The distant hum of delivery trucks signaled the city waking up. I checked my watch. It was 7:45. The guests were instructed to arrive at 10 o'clock sharp. But I knew Virginia. She would never leave the final presentation to chance. She would arrive early to assert her dominance, expecting to find me frantic, exhausted, and desperately trying to finalize the catering arrangements she never paid for. At exactly 8 o'clock, the distinct crunch of heavy tires rolling onto the pristine gravel of my driveway shattered the morning peace. I leaned forward in my folding chair, peering through the intricate wrought iron railing of the piazza. A gleaming silver luxury SUV shifted into park directly below me. The engine cut off. For a long moment, everything was perfectly still. Then, the driver's side door clicked open. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the bitter heat. The stage was set. The curtains were about to open. And the image-obsessed matriarch of the Helen family was about to step into an arena where she had absolutely no power left. The silver luxury utility vehicle crunched onto the pristine gravel of my driveway. I remained seated on the second-floor piazza, observing the scene through the wrought iron railing. The engine cut off. For a tense moment, the morning birds provided the only soundtrack. Then the doors clicked open in unison. Virginia stepped out first. She wore a tailored cream linen blazer, her signature string of pearls resting against her collarbone, her hair spun into a flawless lacquered helmet. Thomas followed, adjusting the cuffs of his imported silk shirt. Preston emerged from the back seat, checking a heavy gold watch he could not afford on his failing contractor salary. They moved toward the front entrance with the casual entitlement of feudal lords inspecting their estate. Virginia did not knock. She did not ring the bell. She simply produced a spare brass key she had copied, without my permission, months ago, and slid it into the lock. The heavy oak door swung inward. Virginia stepped over the threshold, calling out my name in a high melodic pitch engineered to convey affluent Southern charm. But her greeting did not land on plush antique rugs or absorb into velvet curtains. It struck bare plaster walls and echoed back at her sharp and distorted. Her designer heels clipped against the exposed floorboards. She stopped walking. The practiced smile froze on her face. Thomas bumped into her shoulder, opening his mouth to complain about her sudden halt, before the sight of the barren foyer silenced him. Virginia dropped her leather handbag. It hit the floor with a hollow thud that resonated through the empty corridors. She sprinted into the formal dining room, expecting to see my 12-foot mahogany table set with crystal centerpieces. She found nothing but dust motes dancing in the morning light. She pivoted and ran into the parlor, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at the blank walls where original Charleston artwork usually hung. This was Virginia's ultimate nightmare. For decades, my mother had constructed her entire identity around the perception of boundless wealth. She endured Thomas's failing stock portfolio by wearing vintage designer labels and pretending they were old money rather than broke social climbers. Today was supposed to be her crowning achievement, a lavish display of false prosperity staged in my restored home. Now she had 80 elite guests arriving in less than 2 hours, and her grand theater had no set. I stood up from my folding chair, smoothed the front of my emerald trousers, and walked to the top of the grand staircase. I looked down at the three of them. My father was the first to spot me. His face tightened into a familiar mask of calculated disappointment. Thomas did not yell. In the Helen family, raised voices were considered terribly vulgar. Instead, he deployed his weapon of choice, passive blame. He looked at the empty room, sighed heavily, and shook his head. He told me I was having a mental episode. He said the stress of my career had clearly caused a psychological break, and it was a tragedy I chose to humiliate the family name just to cry for help. It was the exact same tactic he used to diminish all my achievements. Our region's culture was intensely competitive, obsessed with elite education and prestige. My parents practically worshipped Preston. They funded his endless failed attempts to secure a medical degree with business class flights and Michelin star dinners. Meanwhile, they treated my own academic success as a trivial afterthought. I hold dual Ivy League degrees, a master's in historical landscape architecture and a prestigious law degree focusing on estate planning. They ignored my legal expertise entirely, preferring to call my architectural career a charming little gardening hobby. They only valued my resources, never my intellect. Preston stepped forward, standing beside our father. He wore a patronizing smirk, treating me not like a sister, but like a disobedient subordinate. He snapped his fingers, demanding I stop playing these childish games. He ordered me to call the staging company, get the furniture back inside, and set up the prep stations in the kitchen immediately. He spoke with the unearned confidence of a 35-year-old man whose parents still paid his auto insurance. I descended the stairs, taking each step with deliberate, measured slowness. I stopped on the final landing, positioning myself slightly above them to maintain the physical high ground. I kept my posture relaxed, my hands resting lightly on the wooden banister. I spoke with the terrifying clinical calmness I utilized during hostile municipal board meetings. I reminded them of the group text message. I pointed out that I never agreed to host this event. I never offered my home or my services. I simply assumed that since Virginia declared they were throwing a party here, they were bringing their own tables, chairs, and decor. I was merely providing the square footage they laid claim to. Virginia's face drained of all color. Her hands shook as she realized I was not bluffing. She clutched Thomas's arm, and her voice rising to a shrill, frantic pitch. She asked what they were going to tell the Montgomerys and the Sinclairs. These were families who sat on the boards of elite hospitals and historical societies, the very people Virginia spent her entire adult life trying to impress. Before Thomas could formulate a lie to save their reputation, a heavy, synchronized chime rang through the empty house. We all turned toward the frosted glass panels of the front door. I checked my watch. It was exactly 9:30 in the morning. This was far too early for the socialite guests to arrive. Through the glass, the distinct silhouette of a large man holding a clipboard stood on the porch. Beyond him, parked illegally on the cobblestone street, was a commercial refrigerated box truck bearing the logo of Charleston's most expensive exclusive catering service. Preston moved to open the door, his chest puffing out slightly, eager to play the wealthy host and regain control of the situation. The head caterer stood on the welcome mat, wiping sweat from his brow in the rising heat. He looked past Preston, his eyes scanning the cavernous, unfurnished hallway. Deep confusion washed over his face. He asked where the prep tables were located and where he should instruct his staff to set up the carving stations. Before Preston could issue an arrogant reply, the caterer flipped a page on his clipboard. He tapped a silver pen against a heavy, itemized invoice. He stated he needed the remaining balance paid in full before his crew would unload the imported seafood towers and the champagne cases. He read the total outstanding aloud. It was $15,000. I watched Preston closely. For a fraction of a second, his smug, entitled demeanor shattered. His jaw tightened, and a flicker of genuine, unadulterated panic crossed his eyes. He quickly shoved his hands in his pockets, stepping back from the doorway, suddenly trying to make himself look smaller. I had not hired a caterer. I had not ordered seafood or champagne. Yet this premium vendor was standing on my porch demanding 5 figures for a contract tied to my address. If I did not sign that agreement, and I certainly did not authorize the charges, someone else had forged a legal document to secure a luxury service they had no intention of paying for. The trap was springing, but the steel jaws were not aimed at me. I instructed the bewildered caterer to pull his commercial box truck around to the rear service alley. I told him to wait inside the barren kitchen and promised his outstanding invoice would be addressed momentarily. He cast one final confused glance at the hollow foyer before retreating down the brick steps. His engine had barely faded down the block when the true invasion commenced. The clock in the nearby church tower struck 10. Within minutes, a procession of sleek European sedans and chauffeured town cars clogged the narrow French Quarter street. The elite of South Carolina high society emerged into the morning humidity. These were families whose names adorned hospital wings and university libraries. They stepped onto my property wearing pastel seersucker suits, imported silk shift dresses, and wide-brimmed hats designed for sipping champagne in shaded gardens. They flowed through the open front doors, their faces arranged in expressions of polite anticipation. They expected to be greeted by the scent of fresh magnolias, the soft notes of a string quartet, and a small army of staff offering silver trays of mimosas. Instead, they collided with a wall of empty space. The sensory contrast was jarring. The foyer smelled faintly of industrial cleaning supplies from the moving crew. The guests' high heels and polished leather loafers struck the bare heart pine floorboards, generating a chaotic, echoing clamor. As more people filed into the unadorned living room, the sheer absurdity of the situation took hold. There was nowhere to sit. There were no tables to hold the expensive velvet-wrapped anniversary gifts they carried. There was not a single piece of art on the plaster walls. In Charleston, social power is a delicate, unspoken currency. The elite do not raise their voices or demand explanations when confronted with a disaster. They weaponize their etiquette. The ultimate Southern freeze-out began immediately. The wealthy attendees stood in tight, uncomfortable clusters against the blank walls, exchanging sharp, sideways glances. Their smiles grew painfully rigid. The phrase, "bless her heart," began to ripple through the crowd, whispered behind manicured hands. In our culture, those 3 words are never a prayer. They are a lethal social verdict, a polite translation for profound pity and hidden contempt. Virginia was unraveling in real time. Her meticulously constructed universe was collapsing in front of the very audience she worshipped. She darted between the influential guests, her eyes wide and frantic, her voice pitched unnervingly high. She laughed a brittle synthetic sound that echoed harshly in the hollow room. She waved her hand, spinning a desperate narrative to anyone who would listen. She claimed the house was undergoing a sudden emergency structural fumigation. She told the hospital board directors that termites had been discovered late last night, forcing a rapid evacuation of all the historic textiles and antique furnishings. Nobody believed her. Wealthy people possess a distinct radar for desperation, and Virginia was radiating it. The guests nodded politely, murmuring hollow sympathies, while actively leaning away from her frantic energy. Thomas stood near the front window, his face flushed a deep, mottled red. He tugged at his silk collar, sweating profusely, entirely paralyzed by the social humiliation. He offered nothing to help his wife, choosing instead to stare a hole into the floorboards, silently blaming me for exposing his lack of control. I did not hide. I walked freely among the bewildered billionaires and the skeptical dowagers, playing the role of the flawless, gracious host. From my overnight bag upstairs, I had retrieved 2 long sleeves of thin red plastic cups, the cheap kind sold at corner gas stations for college parties. I stood at the kitchen sink, filled them with tepid tap water, and carried them out to the guests. I approached the matriarch of the Beaufort family, a woman who famously dictated the guest list for every major charity gala in the state. I offered her a flimsy red cup. I smiled warmly and apologized for the stark accommodations. I explained, in a gentle, carrying voice, that my mother had insisted on surprising me with this party only 48 hours ago, leaving me with virtually no time to prepare a proper seating arrangement for such an esteemed crowd. Mrs. Beaufort took the plastic cup with 2 fingers, her gaze shifting from the cheap rim to Virginia, who was currently sweating through her linen blazer across the room. The dramatic irony was exquisite. By playing the accommodating, overwhelmed daughter, I seamlessly shifted the blame back to its rightful owner. I watched the realization dawn on the guests' faces. They understood they had been summoned to an empty shell by a woman trying to claim ownership over a property that clearly did not belong to her. The facade of my parents' wealth was crumbling, exposing the hollow, grasping ambition underneath. Yet, amidst the awkward shuffling and the forced small talk, my eyes caught a jarring anomaly. Preston was not panicking. While our parents were drowning in public disgrace, my older brother was practically thriving. He had recovered from the caterer's sudden demand for $15,000 with unnatural speed. He was not hiding in the corners or making excuses for the lack of furniture. Instead, he was smoothly working the room. He wore a charismatic, predatory grin, moving purposefully between the most affluent guests in attendance. He targeted the commercial real estate tycoons, the retired surgeons, and the private equity managers. I observed him from across the barren parlor. He stood uncomfortably close to an elderly investor, nodding earnestly while gesturing toward my bare plaster walls and the exposed original brickwork of the fireplace. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored jacket and produced a thick, glossy, professionally printed brochure. He handed it to the investor with a firm handshake. He then pivoted and approached a wealthy widow, offering her the same heavy pamphlet, leaning in to whisper something that made her raise her eyebrows in mild intrigue. He was using my empty house as an exclusive networking event. My brother had spent his entire adult life failing upwards. When he dropped out of his pre-medical programs, my parents simply pivoted the narrative, claiming he was destined for entrepreneurial greatness. They funded his phantom startups and his failed contracting businesses, always protecting him from the consequences of his own incompetence. But handing out promotional materials at an anniversary party was brazen, even for him. I placed my remaining plastic cups on the deep wooden sill of a window and navigated through the crowd. I intercepted an elderly woman, Mrs. Rutledge, just as Preston moved away from her. She was staring at the brochure in her frail, diamond-ringed hands, looking profoundly confused by the document she had just been given. I smiled gently, asking her if she needed a refill on her water. As she looked up, I casually slid the brochure from her loose grip. She blinked, muttering something about Preston being a very forward young man. I looked down at the heavy cardstock in my hands. The cover featured a high-resolution, full-color photograph. My stomach tightened. It was a picture of my formal living room, taken weeks ago, when it was still fully furnished with my velvet settees, my antique Persian rugs, and my mahogany side tables. Bold, gold-embossed lettering stretched across the top of the image. The text did not mention an anniversary. It did not mention a celebration of our parents' 50 years of marriage. I flipped the cover open, my eyes scanning the dense financial paragraphs printed inside. The party was a decoy. The missing furniture was a blessing in disguise. I realized in that single, chilling moment that this gathering was never just a vain social event engineered by my mother. It was a highly coordinated, high-stakes financial trap designed by my brother, and he had invited 80 billionaires into my sanctuary to spring it. The caterer waiting in the back was only the first domino to fall. I needed to know exactly what Preston was selling to these people, and more importantly, how much of my life he had already signed away to get it. I left the chaotic murmurs of the parlor behind and stepped into the stark quiet of the kitchen. The head caterer was pacing across the exposed tile floor. He wore a crisp white chef coat, his face flushed with understandable frustration. He had a crew of 6 people sitting idle in a refrigerated commercial truck out in the sweltering heat, the meter running on premium hourly wages. "Miss Helen," he began, his voice tight with restrained anger, "I run a respectable business. We source our seafood fresh from the harbor at dawn. If you do not provide the designated prep surfaces and pay the remaining balance right this second, my team is driving away and I am taking you to small claims court." I did not flinch at his threat. I understood his position perfectly. He was an honest vendor, caught in a trap he did not construct. I extended my hand, asking calmly to see the work order he was holding. He shoved the heavy clipboard toward me. The document was a standard luxury service agreement detailing champagne towers, imported caviar, and a staff of trained servers. At the bottom of the page, resting on the final line, was a signature in blue ink. It spelled out my full legal name. I stared at the writing. The handwriting was a clumsy, frantic scrawl. The loops of the cursive letters leaned sharply to the left. I write with a distinct rightward slant, a strict habit drilled into me during my rigorous years drafting architectural blueprints. It was an amateur forgery. Someone had signed my identity away to secure luxury goods they could not afford. "I did not sign this document," I stated evenly, handing the clipboard back to him. The caterer let out a sharp, incredulous breath. He tapped his pen against the paper. "Do not play games with me. The initial deposit cleared 3 days ago. $3,000 processed from a credit card bearing your exact name and billing address. You authorized this event." The air in the room seemed to grow thin. $3,000. I retrieved my phone from my pocket and opened my secure banking application. I navigated past my primary checking and savings accounts, scrolling down to the section reserved for inactive lines of credit. Years ago, shortly after I graduated from university, Preston and I temporarily shared a mailing address. During that brief window, he developed the habit of intercepting my mail, opening pre-approved credit offers, and utilizing the numbers for his personal expenses. When I caught him, Virginia and Thomas swiftly intervened. They paid off the small balances and dismissed his actions as a simple misunderstanding between siblings. They demanded I drop the issue to preserve family harmony. I learned my lesson, locked my credit profile, and closed the accounts. Or so I thought. I pulled up the transaction history for an old, obscure retail card I had forgotten to officially terminate. There it was, a pending charge for $3,000, authorized on Tuesday afternoon, payable to Charleston Premier Catering. My brother had not just signed a piece of paper. He had bypassed my security, accessed a dormant financial account, and stolen funds to legitimize his forgery. In the eyes of the law, this was no longer a petty domestic dispute. It was documented wire fraud and identity theft. In the past, my parents would expect me to swallow the financial loss. They would insist I pay the remaining $15,000 to save face in front of the wealthy guests currently mingling in my living room. They relied on my silent compliance to maintain their illusion of a perfect family. I locked my phone screen. I turned to the kitchen island, placed my leather tote bag on the bare surface, and unzipped the main compartment. I pulled out my tablet. "I understand why you are angry," I told the caterer, my tone shifting into the authoritative register I use to direct municipal contractors. "But you are directing your anger at the wrong person." I opened the smart home surveillance application on my device. My property is equipped with high-definition security cameras covering every entry point, installed to protect the historical integrity of the estate. I filtered the video logs by date, selecting Tuesday afternoon, the exact time the deposit was processed on my stolen card. I turned the screen toward the chef. The footage played in crystal clear resolution. It showed the front porch of my home. The caterer himself appeared in the frame, wearing the same white coat, holding the same clipboard. A moment later, the front door opened. Preston stepped onto the porch. We watched in silence as the digital version of my brother engaged in a brief, charismatic conversation. We watched him take the clipboard. We watched him pull a silver pen from his pocket and sign my name on the dotted line. We watched him hand over a physical credit card to be swiped on a mobile card reader. The caterer stared at the tablet, his mouth opening and closing as the reality of the situation washed over him. The anger drained from his features, replaced by a cold, sharp realization. He had been conned. That man, the caterer pointed at the screen, his voice low and tight. He told me he was your project manager. He said you were tied up in a design meeting and authorized him to handle the final walkthrough and deposit. That man is my brother, I replied, and he lied to you. I reached into my bag, retrieved a black ink pen, and wrote a phone number on the back of his business card. I handed it to him. That is the direct line to the local police precinct I instructed. I highly recommend you dispatch your crew back to your headquarters, cut your losses on the perishables, and file a formal police report for fraud. I will email you this security footage before the end of the hour to include in your official statement. The caterer looked at the number, then at me. He gave a slow, solemn nod. He understood I was handing him the exact weapon he needed to recover his stolen time and money. He turned on his heel and marched out the back door, shouting orders to his crew to pack up the trucks. I stood alone in the quiet kitchen. The first layer of the trap was dismantled, but the architect of the scheme was still standing in my living room, oblivious to his impending ruin. I picked up my phone. I opened the camera application and snapped a clear, focused photograph of the forged catering contract resting on the counter. I opened my messaging app, selected Preston's contact name, and attached the image. I typed a single sentence. "The police have your signature on video." I pressed send. I walked quietly toward the swinging door that separated the kitchen from the formal parlor. I pushed it open just an inch, peering through the narrow gap. The elite guests of Charleston were still standing in awkward clusters, whispering behind their hands, desperate to escape the humiliating social freeze-out my parents had created. Preston was standing near the center of the room, smiling his brilliant, hollow smile, preparing to hand another glossy brochure to a retired orthopedic surgeon. His phone vibrated in his breast pocket. I watched his routine pause. He excused himself with a polite nod, reaching into his tailored jacket to retrieve his device. He tapped the screen to unlock it. The physical transformation was instantaneous. The arrogant smirk melted off his face. His jaw went slack. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin the shade of old parchment. He stared at the glowing screen, his eyes darting back and forth as he read the single sentence and processed the undeniable photographic evidence of his crime. He swallowed hard, his throat working anxiously. He looked up from the phone, his gaze darting frantically around the room, until his eyes locked onto the narrow gap in the kitchen door. He saw me watching him. In that silent exchange across a sea of wealthy socialites, my brother realized his era of impunity was over. He knew I held the digital key to his incarceration. The catering fraud was exposed, and his safety net was gone. But as I watched his hands begin to tremble, my eyes drifted down to the item he was still clutching tightly in his left fist, the glossy brochure. The catering deposit was a crime of desperation, a $3,000 theft to set a stage. But Preston did not invite 80 billionaires to my home just to feed them stolen seafood. He brought them here to sell them a product. I stepped fully into the living room, leaving the kitchen behind. I looked down at the copy of the heavy cardstock pamphlet I had intercepted earlier. I ran my thumb over the gold-embossed lettering on the cover, tracing the image of my own living room. The time for polite observation had expired. I flipped the heavy cover open, determined to read the dense financial paragraphs printed on the first page. I needed to know exactly what kind of phantom empire my brother was trying to build inside my empty walls. I stood in the center of the echoing parlor, the glossy brochure heavy in my hands. The pages were thick, high-quality cardstock, the kind of paper that costs a fortune to print and carries the weight of false importance. I flipped through the prospectus, my eyes widening with every turn. It was a masterpiece of corporate deceit. The fund was titled the Palmetto Heritage Real Estate Initiative. The mission statement claimed to specialize in the boutique restoration of Charleston historic estates, focusing on high-end luxury conversions for international investors. The photographs were what stopped my heart. They were professional, wide-angle shots of my home. But they were old shots. They featured my velvet settees in the living room, my antique Persian rugs in the hallway, and the curated gallery wall of original art I had spent years collecting. My home was presented not as a private residence, but as the crowning jewel of Preston's contracting portfolio. The text claimed his firm had orchestrated a $1 million restoration of the estate, utilizing sustainable materials and authentic historic preservation techniques. It was a complete fiction. I had managed every aspect of the restoration myself, hiring the subcontractors, drafting the architectural blueprints, and sourcing the historical timber. Preston had never even stepped foot in the crawl space, let alone overseen the structural reinforcements. He was selling a dream built entirely on my labor, my vision, and my financial investment. He was using the credibility of my hard-won architectural reputation to lure wealthy investors into a fraudulent real estate fund, promising them equity in projects that didn't exist, backed by a house he didn't own. The room felt suddenly intensely claustrophobic. 80 of Charleston's most influential citizens stood around me, their champagne glasses still held at waist height. They had been lured here to witness a performance of family unity, but they had actually walked into a den of financial predators. Preston was essentially running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme, using my home as the bait to reel in the sharks of the private equity world. I didn't wait for him to approach me again. I didn't need to hear his pathetic excuses or his attempts to rewrite reality. I walked into the center of the parlor, my heels ringing out against the bare floorboards with the precision of a metronome. I stopped beside the fireplace, the place where he had stood only moments ago, regaling a retired hedge fund manager with tall tales about his sustainable plumbing solutions. Preston saw me approaching. He tried to move to intercept me before I reached the crowd, but I was faster. I stopped, turned to face the room, and projected my voice with the calm, steady authority I utilized at the Botanical Gardens. "Excuse me, everyone," I said, my voice cutting through the awkward chatter like a scalpel. "I am so sorry to interrupt the anniversary toast, but I think there has been a significant misunderstanding regarding the nature of this event." The crowd fell silent. 80 pairs of eyes turned toward me. Virginia, who had been hovering near the window, gasped, her hands flying to her mouth in a performative display of shock. Preston's face was a mask of cold fury, his teeth clenched so tightly I thought his jaw might snap. I glanced over at him, offering him a sweet, thin smile. "I want to compliment my brother Preston on his creative ambition," I continued, my voice steady and clear. "It takes a truly impressive level of professional audacity to produce a glossy investment brochure for a property that is currently embroiled in active historical conservation litigation, using photographs of my private residence to solicit capital for a contracting firm that has never held a single contract." A collective murmur rippled through the room. The hedge fund manager I had seen talking to Preston earlier took a step forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. He looked down at the brochure in his hands, then back at me. I reached into the leather tote bag I had been carrying. I pulled out a thick stack of papers. They were originals, stamped with the official seal of the Charleston County Recorder of Deeds and the approved building permits from the city's Historical Commission. I held the stack up, the heavy bond paper rustling in the morning air. "I am the sole owner, the principal architect, and the project manager of this estate," I announced, holding the deed high enough for the front row to read the bold black ink. "I have personally overseen every phase of the restoration, and I can confirm that my brother has no stake in this property, nor has he ever been employed by the firms responsible for its maintenance. If you are considering investing in the Palmetto Heritage Real Estate Initiative, I would highly recommend you ask for a list of completed projects that you can physically visit and verify. I think you will find the selection to be remarkably thin. The air in the room shifted. The polite, superficial interest the investors had shown only minutes ago evaporated, replaced by the icy, hard-edged cynicism of people who protect their capital for a living. I saw the retired orthopedic surgeon look down at his brochure with open disgust, his fingers rubbing against the paper as if it were contaminated. He dropped the document onto the floor, the heavy cardstock landing with a dull thud. Others followed suit. Brochures were set down on windowsills, abandoned on the floor, or handed off to disinterested catering staff. Preston's face shifted from fury to a sickly, mottled gray. He tried to speak, to offer a protest, but his voice failed him. He was trapped in the wreckage of his own deception, surrounded by the very people he had tried to swindle, his reputation dissolving under the weight of a simple, undeniable fact. The elite guests began to turn their backs on him, shifting their attention toward the doors. They had no interest in being associated with a failed con artist, and they certainly had no interest in being linked to a scandal of this magnitude. My brother looked utterly shattered. His golden child status, carefully protected by our parents for over 3 decades, had finally failed him. The weight of his own incompetence and the reality of his criminal negligence were crushing him. I felt no pity. I felt only a cold, clinical sense of justice. But just as I prepared to walk away, to leave him to the wolves of the Charleston elite, I felt a heavy hand grab my shoulder. It was a firm, possessive grip that dug into my collarbone. I turned. Thomas stood behind me, his face purple, his eyes bulging with a rage that seemed to transcend the situation. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of the scotch he had been drinking since 8 in the morning. "You arrogant little thief," he hissed. His voice a low, vibrating growl meant only for my ears. "You think you've won. You think you can just burn your own family down to make yourself look like the hero?" He shoved me slightly, his grip tightening until I felt the sharpness of his fingernails against my skin. "You don't know what you've done," he spat, his eyes darting toward the few guests who were lingering in the doorway. "You think you're so smart with your deeds and your permits. You think you've managed to escape us." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whispered, jagged edge. "I have something in my safe that puts you exactly where you belong," he threatened, a cruel, triumphant smirk spreading across his face. "You want to talk about property? You want to talk about ownership. I have a document that renders your fancy little deed completely void. You don't own this house. You never really owned this house." His threat hung in the air, a poisonous, unexpected curveball in a game I thought I had already won. He sounded so certain, so genuinely convinced of his power, that for a single, terrifying heartbeat, I felt the ground tilt beneath my feet. What secret was he hiding in his safe? What could possibly invalidate my legal ownership of the estate? I pulled away from his grip, my heart hammering against my ribs. I looked at him, searching for the fear, but there was only a dangerous, unhinged confidence. He believed he held the ace of spades, the one secret that would drag me back into the dirt where he had kept me for 32 years. He believed he still had the power to make me disappear. I looked around the room. The guests were leaving their departure a steady, rhythmic procession of disappointment and disgust. Preston was trying to salvage some dignity, but he was alone. Virginia was nowhere to be seen. My father was the only one left standing in the center of my home, daring me to challenge him one last time. I squared my shoulders. The trap had been laid, the fraud had been exposed, and I was holding all the cards. But as I watched the hateful, triumphant spark in his eyes, I realized that this battle was far from over. He had one more lie, one more weapon of mass destruction that he was prepared to detonate, and he was daring me to pull the trigger. I took a step toward him, my voice cool, dangerous, and perfectly level. "If you have a document, Thomas, "Bring it out," I said, looking him straight in the eye. "Bring it out and let's show everyone in this room exactly how you've been spending the last 5 years. I'm done hiding. I'm done playing by your rules. If you think you have a secret that can destroy me, show it to me. But I promise you, when you open that safe, the only thing you are going to find is your own ruin." He laughed, a dry, rasping sound of pure malice, and turned toward the kitchen, walking with a heavy, deliberate gait that promised a coming storm. The guests were gone, the party was a corpse, but the true war was just beginning. I watched him walk away, wondering what nightmare he had buried in his safe, and realizing that I was about to walk into the final trap of my life. I followed Thomas out of the parlor and through the echoing hallway. He pushed open the heavy wooden doors leading to the back porch. The midday South Carolina heat hit us instantly, a stifling wave of humidity carrying the scent of sweet jasmine and the faint exhaust of departing luxury cars. Beyond the wrought iron gates of my driveway, a handful of straggling guests stood, waiting for their valets. Thomas stopped near the edge of the brick steps. He spun around to face me, blocking my path back inside. The passive, polite Southern gentleman routine evaporated in the humid air. His face was flushed a deep mottled red, and sweat stained the collar of his expensive silk shirt. He did not lower his voice to a discreet whisper. He wanted to intimidate me. He wanted to remind me of the hierarchy he believed still governed our lives. He pointed a trembling finger at my face. He called me an ungrateful, selfish child. He told me I was nothing without the Helen family name, and that I owed him every single ounce of my professional success. His voice carried across the courtyard, drawing the attention of a retired hospital chief executive who was waiting near the curb. Thomas did not care who heard him. He was desperate to reclaim his authority. He took a step closer, crowding my personal space. He claimed he held moral and legal equity over my entire life. He reminded me that he had bankrolled my elite education. He loudly boasted about paying the exorbitant tuition for my dual Ivy League degrees, framing himself as a selfless patriarch who sacrificed his own comfort to fund my architectural career. Then he played his final card. He brought up the original mortgage on my historic house. He reminded me that when I was 27 years old and attempting to purchase a ruined property, the bank deemed me a risky investment. He had co-signed the loan. He claimed that signature gave him permanent ownership, and the paper sitting in his home safe proved I was nothing more than a tenant in a house he controlled. I stood perfectly still against the porch railing. I let him finish his tirade. I let him exhaust his breath and his hollow threats. Growing up, my maternal grandmother, Pearl, was the only person who recognized my potential. She saw how my parents coddled Preston and ignored my academic achievements. Before she passed away, she established a dedicated educational trust fund, specifically in my name, designed to ensure I graduated without the crushing burden of student loans. Thomas was appointed the executor of that trust. When I started university, he told me the market had crashed. He said Grandmother Pearl's investments were tied up in bad bonds and the money was gone. I believed him. I spent my college years working night shifts at the campus library and taking on 6 figures of federal student debt, while Preston drove a leased sports car our parents paid for. I reached into my pocket and unlocked my phone. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to dismantle a lie. I opened a secured digital folder I had maintained for 5 years. I tapped on a specific PDF file and held the bright screen up for my father to see. I told him I knew exactly what happened to Grandmother Pearl's trust fund. The document on my screen was a digitized bank ledger from over a decade ago. It showed 3 distinct wire transfers. Thomas stared at the glowing numbers, his pointing finger slowly dropping to his side. The ledger proved the trust fund did not disappear in a market crash. Thomas liquidated it. He drained $200,000 of my designated tuition money to cover margin calls on his own failing stock trades. He stole my future to patch the holes in his sinking financial ship, forcing me into a decade of financial hardship just to earn my degrees. I read the routing numbers aloud, ensuring the hospital executive lingering near the driveway heard every single syllable of my father's theft. Thomas opened his mouth, a weak protest forming on his lips, but I swiped to the next document on my phone before he could speak. I addressed his second claim, the mortgage. I acknowledged that he had indeed co-signed the original loan when I bought the ruined estate, but I reminded him of a critical detail he conveniently forgot. 3 years ago, he stopped paying the property taxes on his own primary residence. The county issued a severe delinquency notice, and because his name was attached to my mortgage, his default threatened to place a lien on my historic home. I pulled up a scanned copy of a notarized refinancing contract. I explained that to protect my asset from his gross financial negligence, I underwent a rigorous independent audit. I leveraged my increased salary as the botanical garden director to refinance the entire estate solely under my own name. I bought out his phantom share. I legally severed him from the deed, the loan, and the property rights. I looked him directly in the eyes. I told him the supposed trunk card sitting in his safe was nothing but an outdated, voided piece of paper. He owned zero equity. He had zero legal standing. He was a financial parasite who had been entirely excised from my life. The physical transformation of my father was a pathetic sight. The blustering, arrogant patriarch deflated. His shoulders slumped, and the fiery red anger in his cheeks faded to an ashen, sickly gray. He looked at the phone screen, then at the brick porch beneath his expensive loafers. He had spent his life projecting an illusion of wealth and control, and I had just stripped him bare in front of his peers with cold, forensic precision. Preston emerged from the hallway, stopping near the doorframe. He took one look at our father's defeated posture and understood the war was lost. Preston did not say a word. He simply turned, walked down the side steps, and headed straight for the street, abandoning his parents to save himself. Thomas followed a moment later, his steps slow and heavy, a broken man walking away from a fortress he could not conquer. I watched them leave, feeling a profound, quiet relief settling into my bones. The financial leverage they held over me was officially dead. But as the gate clicked shut behind my father, a new shadow fell across the porch. Virginia stepped out of the house. Her cream linen blazer was wrinkled, her immaculate hair was slightly out of place. Her social empire had just burned to the ground inside my empty living room, and the humiliation had mutated into something terrifying. Her eyes burned with an unhinged, focused hatred I had never seen directed at me before. She walked slowly toward me, stopping just inches away. She did not yell. She spoke in a chilling, deliberate whisper. She told me I had made a fatal miscalculation. She said I might own the brick and the mortar of this house, but she owned the social fabric of Charleston. She reminded me that my position as director of the Botanical Gardens relied entirely on the goodwill of the wealthy donors she spent 50 years cultivating. Virginia leaned in, her perfume thick and cloying in the damp air. She promised me that by Monday morning, my professional reputation would be reduced to ash. She vowed to call every elite family, every hospital board member, and every philanthropic trust in South Carolina. She was going to tell them I was mentally unstable, cruel, and unfit for public leadership. She swore she would not rest until the Board of Trustees stripped me of my title and ran me out of the city. She turned and walked away, her heels clicking a steady, threatening rhythm against the brick path. The party was over, but a new, far more dangerous battle had just been declared. I stood alone on the porch, staring at the empty driveway, realizing that a desperate socialite with nothing left to lose was the most dangerous enemy I could possibly face. Monday morning arrived with a suffocating layer of coastal humidity settling over the city. I pulled my vehicle into the designated director parking space at the Botanical Gardens. The administrative headquarters is housed within a restored antebellum mansion, a property I personally designed the structural reinforcements for before being promoted to executive leadership. Usually the morning atmosphere is vibrant, filled with the energy of botanists, event coordinators, and groundskeepers preparing for the week. Today, an eerie, uncomfortable silence hung in the air the moment I walked through the front doors. My assistant, a sharp and highly efficient young woman named Clara, met me in the main hallway. She did not offer her usual cheerful greeting. Instead, she held a thick stack of printed emails tightly against her chest, her expression grave and pale. She followed me into my private office and shut the heavy oak door behind us. Clara delivered the damage report without hesitation. Starting early Sunday morning, Virginia had executed a scorched earth phone campaign targeting the most influential citizens in South Carolina. My mother had called the matriarchs of every major philanthropic trust, the hospital board directors, and the prominent country club presidents. Her narrative was a masterclass in weaponized Southern pity. She told her elite friends that I had suffered a tragic, sudden psychological collapse. She spun a fabricated tale, claiming I hallucinated a break-in, emptied my own house in a paranoid frenzy, and forced my elderly parents to stand in a barren room while I berated them with delusional accusations. It was the perfect lie. In our prestige-obsessed culture, overt anger is frowned upon. But mental instability is considered a brand-destroying scandal. Virginia knew exactly which buttons to push to make the high society elite distance themselves from me. She painted herself as the heartbroken, long-suffering mother trying to protect her sick daughter from public ruin. The consequences of her sabotage were swift and catastrophic. We were less than 3 weeks away from the most critical fundraising gala of the decade. The event was designed to launch a multi-million-dollar capital campaign to restore the historic glass conservatories, a project that represented the pinnacle of my career. Clara placed the stack of printed emails on my desk. They were formal withdrawal letters. 3 major philanthropic families, the pillars of our funding strategy, had officially pulled their annual endowments, citing concerns over institutional stability. Furthermore, Clara informed me that the Botanical Garden Board of Trustees had invoked an emergency executive session scheduled for 2 o'clock that afternoon. The sole item on the agenda was a vote of no confidence regarding my leadership. Virginia was a long-standing honorary member of the board, a ceremonial title she acquired years ago through aggressive networking. She had spent the last 48 hours securing the necessary votes to terminate my contract. Her goal was to destroy my professional reputation by the end of the business day. I did not panic. Panic is a useless emotion reserved for people who lack data. I placed my purse on the leather chair and looked out the window at the sprawling, pristine gardens I had spent years cultivating. My family thought they were engaging in a country club popularity contest. They thought spreading vicious rumors would be enough to force my resignation and bring me crawling back to them for social redemption. They fundamentally misunderstood the arena we were fighting in. I turned back to Clara. I instructed her to cancel every meeting site visit and phone call on my schedule for the rest of the morning. I told her to access the central accounting server and print hard copies of every vendor receipt, donor log, and contracting bid processed over the past 3 years. Clara looked surprised by the specific request, but she asked no questions. She nodded briskly and left the office. 30 minutes later, she returned carrying 3 heavy cardboard boxes, overflowing with financial records. I took off my blazer, rolled up my sleeves, and began spreading the spreadsheets across the expansive surface of my mahogany desk. I am an architect by trade. My entire professional life revolves around examining complex blueprints, searching for minute structural flaws that could cause a foundation to fail. Corporate financial ledgers operate on the exact same principle. A lie always leaves a mathematical footprint. You just have to know where to look for the uneven weight distribution. For 2 straight hours, the only sound in my office was the rustle of dense paper and the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. I cross-referenced our annual maintenance budgets against the approved vendor index. I traced the flow of capital from our donor endowments down to the ground-level operational expenses. Then, buried in the 3rd box, I found the structural flaw. It was a glaring anomaly hidden within the routine landscaping and external maintenance contracts. 3 years ago, shortly after I was promoted to director, the Board of Trustees mandated an overhaul of our groundskeeping services to prepare for upcoming expansions. Virginia, utilizing her position as an honorary advisor, had strongly recommended a boutique firm called Palmetto Environmental Solutions. Due to her glowing endorsement and supposed vetting of their credentials, the board awarded them the contract without a rigorous secondary review. Looking at the invoice history, I noticed their monthly retainer was 30% higher than the local market average. But inflated pricing was not the fatal error. I pulled the tax identification numbers from the Palmetto Environmental Solutions invoices. Using my desktop computer, I logged into the South Carolina Secretary of State Public Business Registry. I searched for the firm to view their incorporation documents. The business was registered as a limited liability company. I clicked through the public ownership records to find the primary registered agent. The agent was not a seasoned horticulturist or a commercial landscaping veteran. The agent was listed as a shell corporation tied to a post office box in a neighboring county. I recognized that post office box immediately. I opened my personal files and cross-referenced the data. It was the exact same billing address my brother Preston utilized for his defunct contracting businesses. The entire picture snapped into sharp, undeniable focus. Virginia had not just recommended a premium vendor to help beautify the gardens. She had steered a six-figure nonprofit contract directly to a fake company controlled by her golden child. I dug deeper into the itemized invoices. Palmetto Environmental Solutions was billing the botanical gardens for high-end imported fertilizers, rare soil amendments, and specialized botanical treatments that were never actually delivered to our facility. Preston was siphoning charity funds to float his lavish lifestyle, buying custom suits and leasing sports cars with money meant for historical conservation. Virginia was the gatekeeper, using her influence on the board to ensure his fraudulent invoices were approved without scrutiny. It was a brazen, systemic kickback scheme orchestrated right under the noses of the elite board members she was currently manipulating to have me fired. I sat back in my leather chair and took a slow, deep breath. Virginia wanted to frame me as a mentally unstable liability. Instead, she had unknowingly handed me the exact documentation required to expose her as a corporate embezzler. I checked my watch. It was noon. I had 2 hours before the emergency session commenced. I picked up my cell phone and dialed a specific number I kept saved for severe professional emergencies. It was not a public relations manager, and it was not a crisis communications consultant. I spoke for 5 uninterrupted minutes, outlining the situation, detailing the evidence I had just uncovered, and requesting their immediate presence at the botanical gardens. The person on the other end of the line agreed without a single moment of hesitation. At 1:45, I stood up from my desk. I smoothed the wrinkles from my emerald trousers and slipped my tailored blazer back on. I gathered the damning invoices, the state registry printouts, and the fraudulent vendor bids. I neatly arranged the documents into 12 identical leather presentation binders. I placed the binders into my reinforced briefcase and snapped the brass locks shut. I walked out of my office and navigated the long, sunlit corridor toward the executive boardroom. Through the glass walls, I could see the 12 members of the Board of Trustees already taking their seats around the grand conference table. Their faces were solemn, arranged in masks of deep concern. Virginia was sitting at the far end of the room, dabbing the corner of her eye with a tissue, playing the tragic, heartbroken mother to absolute perfection. She believed she had the votes to destroy my career today. She believed she was about to install a compliant puppet director who would never look too closely at the accounting logs. But as I reached for the brass handle of the heavy double doors, I was not alone. I pushed the doors open, stepping into the boardroom alongside a surprise guest whose very presence would change the trajectory of my family's life forever. The heavy double doors of the executive boardroom swung inward. The ambient chatter among the 12 trustees ceased instantly. I stepped over the threshold, feeling the sudden weight of 24 eyes settling upon me. The room was a monument to old wealth, featuring dark mahogany paneling and sweeping floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the botanical gardens. Virginia sat at a small side table reserved for honorary advisors. She pressed a linen handkerchief to the corner of her eye, performing the role of a devastated mother grappling with her daughter's tragic mental decline. Several board members cast sympathetic glances in her direction. They had swallowed her narrative whole. Mr. Caldwell, the chairman of the board and a retired logistics magnate, cleared his throat. He steepled his fingers on the polished wood surface. He wore a solemn expression, the kind reserved for delivering unfortunate corporate news. He stated that the emergency session was convened to address severe concerns regarding institutional stability. He cited the sudden withdrawal of 3 major philanthropic endowments earlier that morning. He noted that public confidence in my leadership had fractured over the weekend due to troubling reports regarding my personal well-being and erratic behavior. A trustee seated to his right, a wealthy real estate developer, leaned forward. He formally introduced a motion for my immediate dismissal, citing the bylaws that protected the organization from reputational harm. I did not interrupt them. I let the formal procedure run its course, allowing the false narrative to reach its peak. Once the motion was seconded, Caldwell asked if I had any final words to offer the committee before they proceeded to a vote. I stepped forward, my posture rigid and my chin held high. I did not offer a tearful defense. I did not address my mother's fabricated stories about the empty house. I turned toward the doorway and nodded. A tall, sharp-featured man in a tailored gray suit stepped into the boardroom. He carried the 12 leather presentation binders I had assembled earlier. Whispers broke out around the table. Caldwell frowned, stating that outside legal counsel was strictly prohibited during executive administrative votes. I smiled a thin, polite smile. I assured the chairman that the gentleman standing beside me was not an attorney. I introduced him as Marcus Reed, an independent forensic auditor specializing in nonprofit compliance and federal tax regulations. I explained that I retained his services proactively to review our operational budgets ahead of the upcoming capital campaign. Marcus moved efficiently around the perimeter of the table, placing a heavy leather binder in front of each trustee. I instructed the board to open their dossiers to the first tab. I addressed the room with clear, unyielding authority. I stated that the reputational damage threatening the botanical gardens did not originate from my personal life. It originated from a systematic, coordinated embezzlement scheme operating right under their noses. I directed their attention to the vendor invoices provided by Palmetto Environmental Solutions. I reminded the board that 3 years ago, Virginia used her honorary status to champion this specific firm, bypassing our standard competitive bidding process under the guise of securing a boutique elite service. I pointed to the printed tax identification numbers and the state business registry documents Marcus had verified. I read the official registered address aloud. It was a post office box in a neighboring jurisdiction. I then produced a secondary document cross-referencing that exact same address to a string of defunct, bankrupt commercial entities previously owned and operated by my older brother Preston. The silence in the boardroom grew thick and dangerous. Wealthy philanthropists detest many things, but nothing provokes their fury faster than discovering they have been conned. I did not stop there. I instructed them to flip to the second tab. I broke down the fraudulent billing cycle. Palmetto Environmental Solutions had been invoicing the charity for premium imported soil amendments, rare botanical treatments, and heavy equipment rentals that were never delivered to our grounds. Preston was printing fake invoices, and Virginia was utilizing her advisory access to rubber stamp the approvals, ensuring the accounting department processed the checks without secondary inspections. They were siphoning charity funds to finance Preston's lavish lifestyle, treating a historic nonprofit institution like a personal automated teller machine. I looked directly at Virginia. The linen handkerchief had dropped from her face. Her performance had shattered. Her skin was the color of chalk, and her mouth hung slightly open in a state of trapped, breathless horror. I delivered the final blow. I informed the trustees that I had flagged these accounting anomalies months ago. Rather than raise a public alarm that could jeopardize our funding streams, I quietly utilized my executive authority to freeze their contract. I blocked the renewal of a 6-figure maintenance agreement, choking off their illicit cash flow and saving the charity from severe federal tax liabilities. I explained that my mother's weekend smear campaign was not born of maternal concern. It was a desperate act of financial retaliation. She realized her fraudulent income stream was permanently severed, so she attempted to assassinate my character, aiming to install a compliant director who would restore her access to the Treasury. Mr. Caldwell closed his leather binder. The solemn pity he previously held for Virginia morphed into a cold, unforgiving glare. He turned his attention toward her. He did not yell, but his voice carried a sharp, jagged edge. He demanded an explanation. Virginia stammered. She grabbed the edge of her table, attempting to formulate a defense, claiming it was a misunderstanding, that Preston was merely subcontracting the labor. But the evidence was insurmountable. The financial footprint was undeniable. The real estate developer who had motioned for my firing immediately rescinded his request. Caldwell struck his gavel. In a matter of minutes, the agenda shifted entirely. The board held a unanimous rapid-fire vote. They permanently revoked Virginia's honorary advisory title. Furthermore, Caldwell instructed the building security personnel to escort her off the premises, serving her with a formal trespass warning and threatening swift legal action if she ever attempted to contact the donor network again. Virginia stood up on trembling legs. She grabbed her designer purse, her eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for a single sympathetic face. She found none. The ultimate Southern freeze-out had turned against her. She walked out of the boardroom in utter disgrace, flanked by 2 uniformed security guards. I thanked the board for their time, gathered my empty briefcase, and left the building. The drive home was quiet. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the confrontation slowly began to recede, leaving a profound, hollow exhaustion in its wake. I navigated the cobblestone streets of the French Quarter, pulling my vehicle into my gated driveway. The house was exactly as I had left it. It was a silent, empty shell. I walked up the front steps, unlocked the door, and stepped into the barren foyer. The afternoon sun cast long, slanted shadows across the floorboards. The victory at the Botanical Gardens secured my professional survival, but a lingering question continued to gnaw at the back of my mind. The catering fraud and the real estate brochures explained Preston's frantic behavior on the day of the party. The embezzlement scheme explained Virginia's desperate attempt to have me fired. But none of those crimes required them to invite 80 elite guests into my private residence for a surprise anniversary celebration. They could have distributed those brochures anywhere. They could have forged a catering contract for a rented venue. Why did they specifically need my house? Why did they need a chaotic, crowded event inside my walls? I walked into the empty kitchen, placing my briefcase on the counter. I retrieved my tablet and opened the smart home surveillance application. I had previously reviewed the footage from Tuesday to catch Preston signing the forged catering contract. Now I needed a broader scope. I decided to review the security logs for the entire week leading up to the disaster. I filtered the digital timeline, searching for any unauthorized access codes or strange motions detected at the front entrance. I scanned through Wednesday. Nothing. I moved to Thursday, 2 days before the party. At precisely 1 o'clock in the afternoon, while I was at work, the front door camera engaged. I watched the video playback. Virginia approached the porch. She did not use the spare brass key she had copied. Instead, she punched a temporary access code into the digital keypad, a code she must have shoulder surfed during a previous visit. The door unlocked. She stepped inside, but she was not alone. A man followed her over the threshold. He carried a heavy leather satchel and a high-powered digital camera. He was not a contractor. He was not a caterer. I recognized his face from regional auction catalogs. He was one of the most exclusive, high-end antique appraisers on the East Coast. I watched the interior foyer camera feed. Virginia guided the appraiser directly toward the gilded 18th century French mirror hanging on the wall. The appraiser put on a pair of white cotton gloves. He inspected the glass, photographed the intricate gold leaf frame, and began writing detailed notes on a ledger. A cold knot formed in my stomach. An appraiser does not evaluate assets unless they are being prepared for a private sale or being leveraged as collateral for a high-interest loan. Preston was drowning in debt. Virginia was cut off from the charity funds. They were hunting for capital, and they had targeted the most valuable artifacts inside my home. The party was never just a networking event. It was a smokescreen. I realized, with chilling clarity, that by emptying my house on Friday night, I had not just ruined a social gathering. I had unknowingly thwarted a massive, coordinated theft. But a glaring, terrifying question remained. An appraiser requires verified proof of ownership before finalizing any valuation for a lender. Preston and Virginia could not leverage my antiques or my property unless they had a legal document proving they had the right to do so. I remembered my father's threat on the back porch. He claimed he had a paper in his safe that rendered my deed void. I grabbed my phone and immediately dialed my Aunt Savannah, the sharpest corporate attorney in the state. I told her we had a critical emergency. The betrayal ran much deeper than a catering scam, and I needed her to dig into the deepest, darkest corners of the county property records before my parents finalized whatever trap they had set. The soft blue light of my tablet screen was the only illumination in the empty kitchen as I rewound the digital video log. I leaned forward, my breath hitching, as the timestamp shifted to Thursday afternoon, 2 days before the anniversary catastrophe. I watched Virginia enter the frame. She navigated the foyer with a practiced, elegant stride, but her posture lacked its usual haughty arrogance. She was anxious, checking her watch every few seconds, her fingers working the clasp of her handbag. Behind her walked a man I recognized instantly. He was a prominent figure in the local art and estate circuit, a high-end antique appraiser known for his discretion and his ability to value entire collections in a matter of hours. He carried a heavy leather satchel and a high-precision digital camera. This was not a social visit. This was a professional inventory. I watched the screen as Virginia guided him toward the formal living room. The appraiser set his satchel down on the floorboards with a heavy thud. He pulled on a pair of white cotton gloves and began his work. He moved with a cold, detached efficiency. He inspected the 18th century French mirror, tilting his head to catch the light, photographing the intricate gold leaf frame from 5 different angles. He then turned his attention to the original oil paintings on the gallery wall. He measured the canvases, checked the signatures, and recorded the details in a small black ledger. He was not just documenting their existence, he was establishing their provenance and current market value. My blood turned to ice as I realized the true scope of the party. It was a Trojan horse. My parents and Preston had spent weeks planning this anniversary event, not because they wanted to celebrate their marriage, but because they needed to provide a plausible, chaotic environment for an appraiser to complete a final verification of assets. 80 guests provided the perfect cover for a team of specialists to walk through my home, catalog my most valuable possessions, and cross-reference them against a loan application. Preston was not just failing in business, he was drowning in high-interest debt, and he had reached the point where he needed to leverage tangible assets to secure a shadow loan. He had tried to treat my house as a pawn shop. If I had not hired the movers to clear the property on Friday night, the appraiser and the representatives from his shadow lender would have returned on Saturday. They would have walked through a fully furnished home, confirmed the presence of the collateral, and Preston would have walked away with a massive cash injection, leaving me to face the legal repercussions when the lender eventually came to foreclose on my assets. I felt a surge of nausea, followed by a hardening of my resolve. This was no longer just about family politics. This was grand larceny. I shut down the tablet and shoved it into my tote bag. I grabbed my car keys and walked out the front door, leaving the house to its silence. I drove directly to the downtown law office of Savannah Thorne. She was the one attorney in Charleston who possessed the rare combination of brilliant legal strategy and an absolute disdain for the town's superficial social hierarchy. She was an African-American woman who had built her reputation by systematically dismantling the corrupt gatekeepers of our local judiciary. She saw the world in terms of evidence, statutes, and accountability. Savannah was waiting for me in her glass-walled office. She didn't offer sympathy or coffee. She simply motioned toward the seat across from her desk, her eyes already fixed on the drive I had brought with me. I handed her the tablet containing the security footage and the folder of documents I had seized from the botanical gardens. She watched the footage in silence. When the appraiser appeared on screen, she paused the video, zoomed in on the leather satchel, and then tapped the screen with her index finger. She looked up at me, her expression unreadable. "They are moving aggressively, Clementine," she said, her voice low and focused. "They are not acting like people who have time to negotiate. They are operating like someone who has a creditor at their throat. If they were looking to leverage your antiques, they needed legal title, or at least a verifiable interest in the property. I need to see the county property records. I need to see exactly how they think they can claim rights to an estate that is clearly deeded to you." She pivoted to her computer, her fingers flying across the keys. She accessed the South Carolina Department of Revenue and the Charleston County Recorder of Deeds portal. She pulled up the history of my historic estate, navigating through the layers of historical ownership liens and zoning permits. I sat back watching her work. She was a master of the bureaucratic maze. She bypassed the standard public summaries and dug into the deep archived filing logs, the records that usually require a subpoena to unlock. She spent 20 minutes cross-referencing the names of the LLCs my brother had used in his previous failed business ventures against the current tax filings for my house. Her brow furrowed. She clicked on a document filed 5 years ago, shortly after I had refinanced the mortgage. "This is interesting," she murmured, pulling the document onto the main screen. "It is an amendment to the original deed, filed as a private addendum. It references a family historic trust. I have never seen this entity before." She opened the addendum. My heart hammered against my ribs as I read the legalese. It was a dense 3-page document that claimed the house was not just a private residence, but part of a generational preservation fund. The fund was structured in a way that granted my parents, Thomas and Virginia, oversight authority regarding the use and disposal of the property's historical assets. But it was not just a management agreement. It was a title lien. They had used a loophole in the state's historical preservation statutes. By registering the property as a site of historical interest under a trust, they had filed a claim that gave them veto power over any financial transactions involving the house. They had filed this document under my name, but the notary's signature was forged, and the filing was made during a week I was away on a site inspection. Savannah traced the lines of the document. "They did not just try to steal your furniture," she said, her voice hardening. "They were attempting to create a legal trap that would allow them to control the house's equity while keeping you responsible for the debt. They were setting up the estate to be used as collateral for any loan they wanted to pull. They weren't just thieves, Clementine. They were orchestrating a title heist." She printed the document, her printer humming with the sound of my life being dismantled by bureaucratic ink. She grabbed a highlighter, marking a section on the 3rd page. "Look here," she commanded. "This clause mentions the tax exemption status. Because they filed this trust under your property records, they have been claiming your historic conservation grants as their own income deductions for the past 5 years. Every dollar of restoration aid you applied for, every tax break you earned for preserving the facade, they have been siphoning off as taxable offset for their own personal expenses." She sat back in her leather chair, her gaze locking onto mine. "This is not a petty family disagreement anymore. This is not about a party or a ruined social standing. This is federal title fraud and tax evasion. They haven't just been stealing from you, Clementine. They have been stealing from the federal government. This is a felony." I stared at the paper. The walls of her office felt as though they were closing in. My parents had spent 5 years playing a long game, slowly constructing a web of legal deception around my home and my professional reputation. They had used me as a tax shelter, as a bank, and as a venue for their social survival. The realization washed over me cold and absolute. They never saw me as a daughter. They saw me as a corporate asset they could mismanage, devalue, and eventually sell off to cover their own failures. I reached out and touched the highlighted clause on the page. The betrayal was complete. I felt a strange sense of clarity, a final shedding of the guilt I had carried since childhood. I was no longer the daughter who needed to earn her parents' love. I was a witness to their crimes, and I was the only person left to hold them accountable. Savannah began gathering her files. We need to move fast. The federal authorities do not appreciate title fraud on historic properties, especially when it involves the misuse of state and federal grants. I am going to draft a formal referral to the IRS investigative unit and the local district attorney. But before we file, I need you to understand something. She paused, waiting for me to look up. Once we pull this lever, there is no going back to the way things were. This will not just expose them to the public, it will subject them to a federal criminal investigation. Your brother will likely face jail time for the catering fraud and the potential lending fraud. Your parents will lose everything. The country club, the elite standing, the lifestyle, the freedom. They will be social pariahs. But more importantly, they will be defendants. Are you ready for that? I stood up, adjusting the strap of my bag. I thought of my parents on my porch, yelling about how I owed them my life. I thought of my brother distributing his fraudulent brochures. I thought of the empty, echoing house that I had protected from their reach. I am ready, I said, my voice steady. They built this life on a foundation of theft and manipulation. It is time the whole thing came down. I walked out of her office into the humid Charleston afternoon. The conflict had escalated from a petty social party to a federal conspiracy. I knew what I had to do next. My parents still believed they had one final card to play, one last secret buried in my father's safe that could destroy me. I needed to see that secret for myself before I contacted the authorities. I needed to know exactly how deep their corruption went and how many other lives they had ruined along the way. I headed toward my car, ready to confront the final hidden skeleton in their closet. I sat alone in the barren kitchen, the only illumination radiating from the single pendant light hanging above the marble island. The silence of the empty estate was heavy, pressing against the plaster walls. It was nearing 10 o'clock at night. The events of the day had stripped away every illusion I ever harbored about my family. I was no longer a daughter navigating a difficult dynamic. I was a target in a sophisticated financial conspiracy. Headlights swept across the front windows, casting long shadows across the bare floorboards. I heard a car engine cut off, followed by the firm, authoritative click of heels ascending my brick steps. I unlocked the front door. My Aunt Savannah stood on the porch holding a thick, reinforced banker's box against her hip. She did not offer a polite greeting. She stepped past me, her expression grim and focused, carrying the heavy cardboard container directly to the kitchen island. Savannah is a woman who deals exclusively in verifiable facts. As a corporate attorney who spent decades dismantling corrupt municipal contracts, she possessed a predatory instinct for hidden paperwork. After I left her office earlier that afternoon, she had bypassed the digital portals and utilized her high-level contacts at the county courthouse to pull the physical archived files tied to my property. She dropped the box onto the marble counter. It landed with a dull, heavy thud. I found the bottom of the rabbit hole, Savannah stated, removing her blazer and rolling up her sleeves. She opened the lid and began extracting thick stacks of paper. Many of the pages were heavily redacted, marked with the black ink of municipal clerks trying to obscure private corporate data. But Savannah knew how to read between the black lines. She spread the documents across the island, arranging them into a timeline that charted the financial history of my home. She tapped a manicured fingernail against a faded contract. It was the original mortgage agreement from when I was 27 years old, the document Thomas had co-signed because the bank deemed my historic renovation project too risky. I want you to look closely at the signature page, Savannah instructed, sliding the paper toward me. I stared at the faded ink. I remembered that day vividly. Thomas had rushed me through the signing process at the bank. He kept checking his watch, sighing loudly, acting as though he was doing me an immense favor by lending his name to my loan. He told me the addendums were just standard boilerplate legalese required by the underwriters. I was young, exhausted from working 80-hour weeks, and desperate to secure the property. I trusted him. I signed where he pointed. Savannah flipped to the following page, an obscure addendum buried deep in the closing packet. When your father co-signed this loan, he did not just guarantee the debt, she explained, her voice dropping to a low, precise cadence. he secretly inserted a structural equity clause. He retained a 1% ownership stake in the property. But he did not hold that equity under his own name. He wrapped it inside a hidden shell corporation. She placed a newly printed state registry document next to the mortgage addendum. It displayed the incorporation details of an entity called the Family Historic Trust. Thomas and Virginia were listed as the sole managing directors. I stared at the corporate filing, trying to comprehend the mechanics of the deception. Why would they go through the trouble of creating a phantom trust just to hold a single percent of a ruined house? Because 1% is all you need to establish a legal nexus for tax purposes, Savannah revealed, answering my unspoken question. She pulled out a separate folder, this one containing copies of federal and state tax filings she had subpoenaed through a contact at the Revenue Department. Over the past 3 years, my architectural career had flourished. I had poured my own blood, sweat, and capital into restoring this estate to its original 18th century glory. Because of my meticulous adherence to historical accuracy, I was awarded several prestigious state-funded historic preservation grants. These grants provided significant financial relief, meant to offset the exorbitant costs of specialized artisan labor and custom materials. Savannah laid the tax records bare. Without my knowledge, Thomas and Virginia had been intercepting the tax documents tied to those specific grants. Using their hidden 1% stake in the fake Family Historic Trust, they claimed the entirety of my historic preservation grants as their own personal income deductions. For 5 consecutive years, my parents committed calculated federal tax fraud. They used the protected status of my property to artificially lower their own tax bracket. Every time Virginia purchased a vintage designer gown, every time they covered one of Preston's failed business loans, and every time they paid their exorbitant country club dues, they were subsidizing their lavish lifestyle with stolen federal tax credits that belonged to me. The revelation shifted the power dynamic entirely. The ground beneath my feet felt as though it had turned to glass. This was not a petty dispute over a catered party or a bruised ego. My parents had weaponized my home against the federal government. Savannah leaned across the marble island, her eyes locking onto mine. The gravity of the situation was absolute. "You are now dealing with federal criminals, Clementine," she warned, her tone sharp and uncompromising. "The IRS does not care about family drama. They care about fraudulent deductions. If you do not report this discovery immediately, the Revenue Department will eventually audit this estate. When they do, they will see your name on the primary deed, and they could view your silence as complicity. You will be indicted as a co-conspirator in a tax evasion scheme." I looked down at the physical evidence of their betrayal, the signatures, the corporate stamps, the calculated multi-year strategy to bleed me dry while smiling in my face. They had tried to destroy my professional reputation at the Botanical Gardens. They had tried to leverage my antiques for a shadow loan. But this was the ultimate treason. They were willing to risk my freedom to maintain their country club facade. "We are going on the offensive," I stated, my voice devoid of any warmth. "Draft the referral. We are sending this to the Criminal Investigation Division." Savannah nodded, a fierce, satisfied gleam in her eye. She gathered the documents, promising to have the legal filings prepared by the end of the week. When she left, the house felt different. The emptiness was no longer just a symptom of the moving trucks. It was a clean slate. The Helen family infection had been diagnosed, and the surgical removal was about to begin. The next morning, the coastal sun baked the cobblestone streets, sending waves of heat rippling over the pavement. I walked down to the wrought iron gate at the edge of my driveway to retrieve the mail. Hidden between a catalog for landscaping supplies and a utility bill was a thick, cream-colored envelope. The paper was heavy, expensive cardstock. The return address was printed in elegant, gold-embossed calligraphy. I recognized the stationer immediately. It was the same boutique artisan Virginia used for all her high society correspondence. I opened the envelope, sliding out a formal invitation. Virginia had not surrendered after her humiliation at the Botanical Gardens. In the elite circles of Charleston, perception is the only reality that matters. To save face after the disastrous empty house party and to project an illusion of unshakable stability to her wealthy peers, Virginia had orchestrated a counter-move. The card cordially invited me to attend a makeup gala honoring the 50th wedding anniversary of Thomas and Virginia Helen. She had rented out a private waterfront dining room at the elite Carolina Yacht Club. The date was set for this coming Saturday, the actual calendar date of their anniversary. I stared at the elegant gold script. The audacity was breathtaking. The Carolina Yacht Club is an institution where membership requires a pristine public record and a bloodline tracing back generations. It is a fortress of old money and rigid etiquette. Virginia was hosting this gala to control the narrative. She intended to gather the same 80 billionaires and socialites, pour expensive champagne down their throats, and pretend the empty house was just a silly misunderstanding, a minor hiccup in an otherwise perfect legacy. She was daring me to show up. She assumed I would be too intimidated by the venue to cause a scene. She believed the strict, unwritten rules of Southern propriety would force me to sit quietly, eat my poached salmon, and play the role of the dutiful, subdued daughter. She thought she still held the reins. I walked back up the brick path to my barren foyer. I held the invitation in one hand. I thought about the forged catering contracts. I thought about Preston's fraudulent real estate brochures. I thought about the hidden shell corporation, the stolen tax credits, and the shadow appraiser evaluating my antique mirrors. I walked into the kitchen and found a black ink pen. I pulled the small matching RSVP card from the envelope. I checked the box marked yes. I sealed the response card in the provided envelope and placed it on the counter to be mailed. I was going to attend the makeup gala. I was going to step right into the center of Virginia's pristine, curated theater. But I would not be playing the role she assigned me. I was going to deliver a performance that Charleston High Society would remember for the next 50 years. I looked over at the blank wall where my mahogany table used to sit. The final battle lines were drawn. The only question remaining was a matter of etiquette. What kind of gift do you bring to the people who tried to destroy you? Saturday evening arrived with a heavy, fragrant breeze rolling off the Atlantic Ocean. The Carolina Yacht Club stood on the edge of the historic Battery, a formidable fortress of red brick and towering white columns. Within the rigid hierarchy of Southern high society, this institution was the undisputed pinnacle. Membership could not be purchased with mere wealth. It required a pristine public record, generations of strategic marriages, and an unspoken agreement to maintain the polished facade of the local elite. Inside the private waterfront dining room, the atmosphere was steeped in old-world affluence. The air smelled of expensive beeswax polish, roasted duck, and imported floral arrangements. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the scene. The walls were lined with grand maritime oil paintings, depicting the ancient merchant ships that had built the original fortunes of the families currently sipping cocktails below them. My parents had spent 3 decades clawing their way into this room. Virginia had endured endless patronizing committee meetings and written exorbitant donation checks she could barely afford, just to secure her spot among the Blue Bloods. Tonight, she was leveraging every single ounce of that fabricated goodwill to save her sinking ship. I paused near the arched entryway, observing the theater before making my presence known. Virginia was holding court near the head table. She wore a sapphire silk gown that caught the chandelier light, her posture radiating artificial confidence. She was flanked by hospital board directors, shipping magnates, and the very philanthropist she had called on Monday to sabotage my career. I could hear her melodic, practiced drawl carrying over the soft notes of the string quartet playing in the corner. She was actively spinning the narrative of the empty house. She waved her hand dismissively, laughing a light, airy laugh. She told a captive audience that my little remodeling mishap last week was just a silly misunderstanding. She framed herself as the magnanimous, forgiving mother, explaining that young professionals undergo such tremendous stress, and it is a parent's duty to offer nothing but boundless grace when their children stumble. The wealthy guests nodded along, their champagne flutes catching the light, eager to accept a tidy explanation that required no further scandal. Thomas stood a few paces behind her, wrapped in a bespoke tuxedo. He nodded in agreement with her fabricated stories, swirling the amber liquid in his rocks glass. He looked polished, but I could see the subtle tension in his jaw. He still believed the secret trust document sitting in his home safe was an impenetrable shield. He thought he had tamed me, confident that his financial leverage would force me to play along with this charade. Near the mahogany bar Preston was attempting to mingle, he looked desperate. The golden child charm that had shielded him for 35 years was failing. He tried to engage a prominent real estate developer in conversation, but the developer offered a tight smile and quickly turned away, checking his watch. The gossip from the disastrous empty house party had already infected the room. Preston was becoming a liability, and the elite were beginning to distance themselves. I stepped fully into the dining room. I had chosen my attire with surgical precision. I did not wear a flashy designer label meant to scream for attention. I wore an understated floor-length emerald gown. The fabric draped elegantly, whispering of quiet, established wealth. I wore no heavy jewelry, only a simple gold pendant resting against my collarbone. My hair was swept back into a severe, polished twist. I projected absolute, unshakable calm. I did not carry a velvet-wrapped anniversary present. I did not hold a silver tray of apologies. Cradled in my arms were 20 identical, heavy leather folders. They were dark navy, bound in thick hide, and embossed with the official seal of the South Carolina State Archives on the bottom right corner. They looked official. They looked expensive. They felt like a loaded weapon resting against my ribs. My arrival caused a subtle ripple in the ambient noise. Conversations dipped into hushed, curious whispers as the guests noticed me. They expected me to look defeated, nervous, or frantic to make amends for the previous weekend. Instead, I moved through the room with fluid, practiced grace. I offered warm, flawless smiles to the dowagers. I exchanged polite pleasantries with the hedge fund managers. I blended seamlessly into the rigid etiquette of the space, a ghost moving through a house of cards. There were 20 round dining tables arranged across the plush carpet, each set for 4 guests. The tables were draped in crisp white linen and adorned with towering centerpieces of white orchids and silver candelabras. As I navigated the floor, I approached each table with a measured stride. I quietly placed one leather folder precisely in the center of the setting, leaning it gently against the base of the floral arrangements. I performed the task with the efficiency of a high-end event coordinator, ensuring the embossed seals were facing outward for the guests to see. From across the room, Virginia tracked my movements. Her eyes locked onto the dark leather folders. A triumphant, gloating smile spread across her face. In her narcissistic reality, there was only one possible explanation for my behavior. She assumed I had surrendered to her authority. She believed those folders contained customized, expensive dinner menus I had commissioned to make amends. Or perhaps she thought they held a formal printed public apology to the esteemed families I had inconvenienced last week. She thought I was kissing the ring publicly, submitting to the Helen family hierarchy. The catering staff began circulating pouring wine in preparation for the first course. The ambient chatter swelled to a steady, comfortable hum. Virginia sensed the perfect theatrical moment had arrived. She retrieved a silver spoon from her table setting. She tapped the spoon against the crystal rim of her champagne flute. The sharp, clear chime cut through the noise of the room. The string quartet immediately faded into silence. 80 faces turned toward the head table. Virginia stood tall, the undisputed queen of her manufactured kingdom. She spoke with a honeyed, carrying voice that demanded absolute attention. She welcomed her cherished friends to this momentous occasion. She spoke passionately about the enduring power of family legacy, the inevitable trials of raising ambitious children, and the beautiful healing grace of forgiveness. She painted a picture of a household that had weathered a minor storm and emerged stronger than ever. She looked directly at me. Her eyes gleamed with toxic victory. She raised her glass in my direction. She announced to the silent crowd that her prodigal daughter had returned to the fold to celebrate this milestone. With a dramatic, sweeping gesture of her arm, she invited me to step up to the microphone positioned near the grand piano. She urged me to share a few words of reflection with the people who had supported our family for decades. The trap she had set was beautifully constructed. She was using the intense social pressure of the Carolina Yacht Club to force me into a public declaration of loyalty. I did not hesitate. I walked toward the front of the room, my heels sinking slightly into the rich carpet. My heart beat in a slow, steady rhythm. The fear that had dictated my childhood was entirely gone. I reached the grand piano. I grasped the cold metal of the microphone stand and adjusted it to my height. I looked out at the sea of expectant, wealthy faces. They were sitting in their tailored suits and silk dresses, holding their crystal glasses, waiting for a tearful apology. They had no idea what was resting in the center of their tables. The stage was set for the ultimate reckoning, and 80 of Charleston's most influential citizens were about to become my jury. I stood behind the polished brass microphone stand. The dining room of the Carolina Yacht Club fell dead silent. 80 pairs of eyes focused on me. The clinking of heavy silverware against fine bone china stopped entirely. The waitstaff paused near the swinging kitchen doors, holding silver trays of roasted duck suspended in the air. I looked toward the head table. Virginia was practically vibrating with anticipated triumph. She held her crystal champagne flute high, expecting a tearful, submissive tribute to her fabricated maternal grace. I looked at Thomas. He stood rigid in his tailored tuxedo, his chin tilted upward in arrogant defiance, confident that his hidden home safe held the ultimate leverage over my life. I leaned into the microphone. My voice echoed through the high-quality acoustic speakers, carrying a sweet, perfectly pitched Southern drawl. I thanked my parents for this opportunity. I told the room I wanted to express my deepest, most sincere gratitude to Virginia and Thomas for teaching me the true value of honesty, transparency, and legacy. The irony tasted metallic and sharp on my tongue, but I kept my tone warm, inviting, and flawlessly polite. I told the esteemed attendees that a milestone like a 50th anniversary required a very specific kind of commemoration, something permanent and documented. I gestured toward the center of the round dining tables. I invited the guests to open the dark leather folders I had placed by the floral centerpieces. Around the opulent room, manicured hands bearing diamond rings and heavy gold watches reached for the thick hide bindings. The collective sound of heavy parchment paper turning filled the space, resembling the rustle of dry autumn leaves. The folders did not contain customized dinner selections or printed apologies. They contained high-resolution, color-printed copies of irrefutable financial evidence. I had organized the contents meticulously. I utilized bright yellow highlighter ink to draw their eyes directly to the most damning legal clauses and the most incriminating monetary figures. I did not raise my voice. I maintained a calm, conversational volume, narrating the complex financial crimes, as if I were giving a routine guided tour of a historic garden. I began with the events of the previous weekend. I explained exactly why my historic French Quarter estate was barren on the morning of their surprise gathering. I told the crowd it was not a sudden remodeling mishap or an emergency structural fumigation, as my mother had claimed. I revealed that my parents orchestrated the surprise gathering as a chaotic smokescreen. They needed 80 wealthy bodies in the room to serve as a distraction. 2 days prior to the event, they had smuggled a high-end antique appraiser inside my doors. I detailed how my older brother Preston was attempting to leverage my 18th century French mirror and my original oil paintings as collateral. He intended to secure a desperate shadow loan for his bankrupt shell companies, risking my personal assets to cover his own spectacular failures. I then directed the attendees to the second page in their folders. I explained the catering fiasco. I pointed out the luxury service contract bearing my clumsily forged signature, positioned directly alongside the credit card receipt, proving Preston had stolen funds from my dormant account to pay the initial deposit. I glanced toward the mahogany bar where Preston had been standing moments earlier. His charismatic smirk had vanished. He was slowly backing away toward the heavy velvet curtains, scanning the perimeter for an exit, realizing that every prominent real estate developer in the city was currently reading the undeniable proof of his fraud. The golden child was looking for a place to hide. But the exits were guarded by the reality of his own actions. The wealthy citizens of Charleston are a very specific breed of human. They tolerate quiet infidelities they turn a blind eye to, towering arrogance, and they often reward ruthless corporate tactics. But they abhor financial scandal, common tax evasion, and tacky grifting. To steal from your own blood relative to maintain a country club membership was an unforgivable social sin. I watched genuine horror wash over the room. The hospital board directors stared at the highlighted tax forms in sheer disgust. The shipping magnates pushed the leather folders away as if the paper itself carried a lethal disease. The polite, superficial smiles dissolved into expressions of icy, unforgiving revulsion. I guided them through the final pages of the dossier. I explained the mechanics of the Hidden Shell Corporation. I detailed how Thomas and Virginia utilized an obscure loophole in the state preservation statutes to claim my architectural labor as their own personal income deduction. I laid bare the grim reality that the designer silk gowns they wore, the bespoke suits they flaunted, and the expensive imported champagne they were currently drinking were subsidized by calculated federal tax fraud. They were essentially stealing from the government to pretend they still belonged in this elite waterfront dining room. Virginia dropped her crystal flute. It shattered against the plush carpet, the expensive wine soaking deep into the woven fibers. Her carefully cultivated social empire was being systematically annihilated in front of her most important peers. The color drained rapidly from her face, leaving her skin a ghastly, translucent white. She gasped for air, clutching the neckline of her sapphire gown, searching the room for a single sympathetic gaze. She found nothing but cold, silent judgment. Every single person at the nearby tables averted their eyes. The freeze-out was instantaneous and total. I stared at the woman who gave birth to me, watching her drown in her own deceit. I intended to deliver my closing remarks with cold, analytical precision, but as I looked at her empty, panicked expression, an unexpected wave of sorrow hit the back of my throat. For a fleeting second, my polished armor slipped. My voice hitched in the microphone. A raw, suppressed grief bled into my words. I was not mourning the loss of the people standing in front of me. I was mourning the parents I never really had, the nurturing, protective figures that existed only in childhood fantasies and television screens. I swallowed the lump in my throat, forcing the vulnerability down, and tightened my grip on the cool metal of the microphone stand. Thomas realized the severe gravity of the situation. His hidden trust document was no longer a secret weapon kept in a dark safe. It was printed in black and white and distributed to 80 local billionaires. The illusion of his patriarchal control evaporated into the humid night air. A primal, desperate rage seized him. He let out a guttural, furious sound, abandoning his polished gentleman persona entirely. He lunged forward, charging toward the grand piano to silence me. He intended to physically rip the microphone from my hands and stop the broadcast of his systemic crimes. His heavy leather shoes pounded against the floor, his face twisted into an ugly mask of pure hostility. The guests seated near the front gasped, pulling their chairs back to avoid his reckless path. I did not step back. I held my ground. Before Thomas could reach the edge of the low wooden stage, a tall figure intercepted him. The general manager of the Carolina Yacht Club, a stern, broad-shouldered man who had been thoroughly briefed by my legal counsel earlier that afternoon, stepped directly into the path of my father. The manager placed a firm, unyielding hand squarely on the chest of Thomas, halting his reckless momentum instantly. 2 uniformed private security personnel materialized from the dark kitchen corridor, moving swiftly to flank my father, ensuring he could not advance a single inch further. The trap had snapped shut, and the physical threat of my father was neutralized, leaving him humiliated and restrained in front of the entire city. Thomas struggled against the firm grip of the general manager. The crisp silk of his bespoke tuxedo jacket bunched awkwardly around his shoulders. He barked hollow commands demanding the security personnel release him, immediately asserting his status as a paying host. The manager did not flinch. He simply tightened his hold, maintaining a cold, professional barrier between my father and the low wooden stage. The physical restraint was the ultimate indignity for a man who believed his mere presence commanded absolute obedience. He was reduced to a flailing, impotent spectacle in front of the very people he spent decades trying to impress. The two uniformed guards held their positions, ensuring he could not advance toward the microphone. I turned my attention away from the struggle and looked back at the sea of pale, horrified faces. The wealthy attendees were frozen. Their eyes darted from the highlighted tax documents in their dark leather folders to the chaotic scene unfolding near the grand piano. I leaned into the microphone one last time. The time for narrative exposition had concluded. It was time to deliver the closing verdict. I needed them to understand that this was not just a domestic squabble over a piece of historic real estate. This was a documented legal reckoning. I informed the quiet room that the dossiers sitting on their tables were not merely printed for their entertainment. They were exact duplicates of the evidentiary files I had legally submitted earlier that afternoon. I stated clearly and concisely that my legal counsel had officially filed formal criminal reports with the local police precinct regarding the wire fraud and the forged catering contracts. Furthermore, a comprehensive disclosure packet detailing the Hidden Shell Corporation and the stolen historic preservation grants was already resting on the desk of a senior investigator at the Internal Revenue Service. I made sure every single syllable echoed through the high-quality acoustic speakers. The air in the dining room turned instantly frigid. The elite of South Carolina might tolerate a minor scandal, but they will sprint away from an active federal investigation. By alerting the authorities, I had transformed my parents from tacky grifters into radioactive legal liabilities. I looked directly into the terrified, wide eyes of Virginia. Then I shifted my gaze to Thomas, who had finally stopped struggling against the security guards and was staring at me in sheer disbelief. I let a sweet, perfectly practiced Southern smile touch the corners of my mouth. I issued a chillingly polite farewell. Bless your hearts, and good luck with the audits. I reached up and clicked the small black switch on the side of the microphone. I lifted the device from the brass stand and set it down gently on the polished surface of the grand piano. The dull click echoed through the silent room, finalizing the severance. I stepped off the low wooden stage and smoothed the front of my emerald gown. The reaction from the 80 guests was immediate, coordinated, and devastating. In other social circles, a revelation of this magnitude might incite shouting demands for refunds or chaotic arguments. But this was the Carolina Yacht Club. The wealthiest families in the city execute their judgments through total silence. The ultimate passive-aggressive freeze-out commenced. It started at a table near the back corner. The matriarch of a prominent shipping family, a woman who dictated the charity gala guest lists for the entire state, stood up. She did not say a word to the people seated beside her. She simply lifted her heavy linen napkin from her lap, folded it with deliberate precision, and placed it onto the center of her porcelain dinner plate. The scrape of her wooden chair pushing back against the hardwood floor sounded like a cracking whip in the quiet room. Her movement broke the spell. All around the opulent waterfront dining room, chairs began to slide backward. Dozens of billionaires, hedge fund managers, and hospital board directors stood up in unison. They left their crystal champagne flutes half full. They left the expensive roasted duck untouched on silver serving trays. They placed their folded linen napkins on the tables, signaling the formal end of their participation in the Helen family illusion. The procession toward the grand arched exits began. It was a silent, beautifully choreographed exodus. The guests moved with unhurried dignity, their faces arranged in masks of cold, aristocratic indifference. They walked right past the head table where Virginia stood. They did not pause to offer their sympathies. They did not demand an explanation. They refused to make eye contact. Looking at Virginia would acknowledge her existence. and in their eyes, she had already ceased to exist. Virginia reached out a trembling hand toward a passing socialite, a woman she had played tennis with every Tuesday for the past 10 years. She whispered the woman's name, a desperate, raspy plea for a lifeline. The woman did not even turn her head. She walked past my mother as if she were stepping around a pile of discarded trash on the sidewalk. Virginia drew her hand back, pressing it against her mouth, as a silent, ugly sob racked her chest. The social empire she sacrificed her own daughter to build was evaporating before her eyes, leaving nothing but the bitter reality of her impending criminal charges. Near the mahogany bar, the exodus triggered a frantic reaction from Preston. The golden child was watching his fraudulent financial future walk out the door. He spotted the prominent commercial real estate developer, the very man he had tried to swindle earlier that evening, moving toward the exit. Preston lunged forward, abandoning any pretense of composure. He reached out and grabbed the sleeve of the developer's bespoke suit jacket. Preston stammered, pleading for a brief conversation, desperately claiming the documents were a misunderstanding and promising he could explain the return on investment. The developer stopped. He looked down at the hand clutching his sleeve. He did not yell. He simply narrowed his eyes, radiating a level of wealthy contempt that could freeze boiling water. He sharply jerked his arm away, brushing Preston off like a common beggar asking for loose change. The developer adjusted his cuff, stepped around my brother, and walked out the door without uttering a single syllable. Preston stumbled backward, his back hitting the solid mahogany bar. He looked down at his empty hands, the reality of his profound failure finally piercing his inflated ego. He was no longer the brilliant entrepreneur on the verge of a breakthrough. He was a documented fraudster facing imminent arrest, and the people he wanted to impress the most had just treated him like a contagious disease. I stood near the entryway watching the final guests file out into the humid night. Within 5 minutes, the lavish dining room was abandoned. The string quartet had packed their instruments and slipped out through the kitchen corridor. The waitstaff remained hidden behind the swinging doors, refusing to service a dead event. The only people left in the center of the glittering room were Virginia Thomas and Preston. They stood isolated among the abandoned tables, surrounded by the wreckage of their own deceit. They were stripped of their wealth, their fabricated status, and their toxic power. The unearned authority they had wielded over my life for 3 decades was gone, replaced by the terrifying certainty of federal audits and prison sentences. They were finally forced to look at each other, realizing they had no one else to blame and nowhere left to hide. I did not offer a final parting word. I did not need to. The silence was the most powerful statement I could ever make. I turned my back on the empty shell of the Helen family. I walked out the grand front doors of the Carolina Yacht Club. The heavy brass doors clicked shut behind me, sealing them inside their own ruin. I stepped out onto the wide brick promenade. The cool, salt-tinged harbor breeze washed over my face, carrying the scent of the open ocean and the undeniable, brilliant weight of absolute freedom. 2 months passed since the silent exodus at the Carolina Yacht Club. The transition from late summer to early autumn brought a crisp edge to the Charleston air, banishing the oppressive coastal humidity. Inside my historic French Quarter estate, the echoing emptiness was a distant memory. A specialized delivery crew had arrived days after the disastrous anniversary dinner, carefully unboxing and placing my life back where it belonged. The velvet settees returned to the formal parlor, arranged meticulously near the original exposed brick fireplace. The thick Persian rugs once again muffled my footsteps, absorbing the ambient sound and adding profound warmth to the restored heart pine floorboards. In the foyer, the 18th century gilded French mirror was rehung with exacting precision. It reflected a space cleansed of deception. The house smelled of lemon oil, fresh hydrangeas, and quiet security. It was no longer a stage for my parents to perform their wealthy socialite illusions. It was a fortress. The physical restoration of my home mirrored the internal recalibration of my own mind. Waking up each morning without the lingering dread of an impending familial ambush allowed me to breathe deeply for the first time in 3 decades. I no longer checked my phone expecting a manipulative text message demanding my time or my resources. The silence they left behind was not lonely. It was a vibrant, restorative quiet. My professional life flourished in the absence of their relentless sabotage. The annual Botanical Garden Gala, the very event my mother had attempted to destroy through her coordinated smear campaign, took place beneath the sprawling branches of our ancient live oaks. The evening unfolded as a spectacular triumph. The same philanthropic families who had walked out of the yacht club attended my fundraiser, their checkbooks open and their support unwavering. We shattered all previous charitable records, raising enough capital to fully fund the historic Glass Conservatory restoration and establish a brand new educational endowment for local students. The Board of Trustees, having witnessed my decisive handling of the embezzlement scheme, granted me unprecedented operational autonomy. I stood on the podium that night, wearing the same emerald gown I had worn to the yacht club, looking out over a sea of generous patrons. I realized my status as a respected civic leader was secured. I did not need the Helen family name to legitimize my presence in this city. My architectural talent and ethical boundaries spoke for themselves. The guests approached me throughout the evening, offering warm handshakes and genuine praise. Nobody mentioned my parents. The elite of Charleston had excised them from the collective memory, treating their existence as a closed, distasteful chapter. While my world expanded, the universe my parents inhabited rapidly collapsed. The federal revenue agents did not issue polite warnings or offer negotiated settlements. The Criminal Investigation Division launched a comprehensive, invasive audit into the fake Historic Preservation Trust. Federal inspectors scrutinized decades of my father's financial ledgers, seizing banking records and freezing multiple investment portfolios. Without my income to offset their lavish spending, Thomas and Virginia faced insurmountable tax penalties and looming indictment charges. The social exile was equally devastating and infinitely more painful for a woman who worshipped status. The Carolina Yacht Club revoked their membership, sending a terse letter of expulsion via certified mail. The elite country clubs followed suit, erasing their names from the coveted rosters. Virginia could no longer secure a dinner reservation at her favorite downtown restaurants. When she walked down King Street, former friends crossed the pavement to avoid acknowledging her existence. The social isolation she once wielded as a weapon against me had become her permanent, inescapable reality. They were pariahs, trapped in a crumbling facade, drowning in mounting legal fees and unpaid luxury car leases. The fortress of arrogance they had built around themselves crumbled into dust. My older brother Preston experienced his own spectacular, highly public descent. The fraudulent real estate prospectus and the forged catering contracts triggered a wave of swift creditor lawsuits. His phantom contracting firm declared bankruptcy under the crushing weight of undeniable evidence. The authorities seized his assets to liquidate and distribute among the people he had swindled. The bankruptcy court scheduled a public auction to sell off his remaining commercial landscaping equipment. I attended the auction on a bright Tuesday morning. I wore a tailored suit, standing quietly near the back of the municipal lot while the auctioneer chanted over the microphone. The inventory included a fleet of heavy-duty utility tractors and commercial mulch loaders. These were the exact machines Preston had purchased using stolen charity funds, pretending to run a legitimate environmental solutions company. The bidding was sparse. I raised my numbered paddle, securing the entire fleet for pennies on the dollar, using surplus funds from our new garden endowment. I arranged for the equipment to be transported directly to the botanical gardens, watching my groundskeepers use Preston's repossessed tractors to haul literal dirt and mulch across my flower beds provided a profound poetic satisfaction. He tried to sell a fraudulent empire, and I bought his tools to tend my gardens. The machinery that was meant to fund his deceit was now cultivating authentic beauty. The culmination of this arduous journey crystallized on a quiet Friday evening. I sat on my second-story piazza, the exact same spot where I had watched my mother panic in the empty foyer 2 months ago. The heavy iron gates marking the entrance to my driveway were pulled shut and securely locked, a physical, unyielding barrier, keeping the chaos of my former life out on the street. The autumn breeze drifted off the harbor, carrying the scent of salt and blooming Confederate jasmine. The sky shifted into bruised shades of violet and deep orange, casting a serene glow over the French Quarter. Aunt Savannah walked out onto the wooden deck. She took a seat in the woven wicker chair beside me. She wore a relaxed linen dress, her usual sharp courtroom demeanor softened by the peaceful atmosphere. She held 2 tall crystal glasses filled with iced sweet tea, garnished with fresh mint leaves from my own backyard. She handed one glass to me. We did not need to discuss the pending federal indictments, the auction receipts, or the gossip echoing through the city. The forensic dismantling of the Helen family deception was complete. The truth had sterilized the wound, leaving healthy tissue behind to heal. Savannah raised her glass toward the horizon. I raised mine to meet hers. The crystal chimed a bright, clear sound ringing out over the quiet courtyard. It was a silent toast to survival, to the undeniable power of empirical evidence, and to the brilliant clarity of a severed tie. I leaned back in my chair and looked out over the pristine historical estate I had built, defended, and reclaimed. The manicured hedges and the ancient oak trees stood tall against the fading twilight. I had lost the toxic relatives who spent 32 years trying to extract my worth. They were gone, banished to a purgatory of their own making. In their place, I gained the one treasure they had relentlessly tried to steal. I possessed an unshakable, profound peace, built on a foundation that could never be compromised. In the quiet, manicured streets of Charleston, South Carolina, and affluent neighborhoods across the broader American landscape, there exists a pervasive and dangerous cultural mythology. It is the deeply ingrained belief that a pristine public facade equates to a healthy, functioning foundation. We are taught by traditional society to revere the institution of the family, to view bloodlines as unbreakable bonds of mutual support, and to believe that a parent's love is inherently unconditional. But the saga of Clementine Helen, a chilling narrative of an empty historic estate, a fraudulent golden anniversary, and a forensic dismantling of parental deceit, serves as a brutal autopsy of the traditional family structure when it is hollowed out by vanity and greed. To understand the tragedy of the Helen family is to understand the darkest distortions of the American dream. In a culture that rightfully champions hard work, independence, and earned success, toxic family systems invert these values. Instead of fostering independence, parents like Virginia and Thomas view their children not as autonomous human beings to be nurtured, but as corporate assets to be leveraged. Their parenting model was not built on the foundational values of fairness, honesty, or moral integrity. Instead, it was constructed on a transactional ledger, where affection was doled out based on who could best serve their insatiable need for social validation. This transactional approach creates a devastating psychological dichotomy within the home: the pampered golden child and the neglected scapegoat. By repeatedly shielding Preston from the consequences of his own incompetence, Virginia and Thomas did not actually love their son. They crippled him. They funded his vanity, paid off his debts, and fed his unearned ego, ultimately turning him into a hollow, desperate man, incapable of genuine achievement. He became a predator, dressed in bespoke suits, willing to defraud his own sister and manipulate investors just to maintain the illusion of success his parents demanded. Conversely, Clementine was treated as a disposable utility. Her brilliance, her grueling work ethic, and her eventual promotion to director of the Botanical Gardens were never celebrated for her own sake. Her achievements were merely resources to be harvested by her parents. This gross disparity in parental guidance highlights a critical lesson regarding long-term family responsibility. When parents fail to apply fairness and emotional intelligence to their children, they do not just fracture the sibling bond, they guarantee the eventual catastrophic collapse of the entire family ecosystem. Ideally, the American family operates as a sanctuary, a secure training ground where children learn the virtues of integrity and the strength of character. However, toxic parents often weaponize these exact traditional values, duty, respect, and hospitality, to mask their own exploitation. Virginia and Thomas used the guise of a 50th anniversary and the unspoken rules of Southern hospitality to orchestrate a literal and financial heist against their own daughter. They demanded familial loyalty while simultaneously committing federal tax fraud. They demanded respect while secretly ushering an antique appraiser into her home to secure a shadow loan. If Clementine's journey of reclaiming her peace, exposing the truth, and setting unbreakable boundaries resonates with your own experiences, or if you simply appreciate the raw, unvarnished reality of these complex family dynamics, I invite you to subscribe and follow Morning Revenge. By joining our community, you help us continue to explore these intricate narratives of justice, emotional survival, and the ultimate triumph of accountability. Drop a comment below and let us know your thoughts on Clementine's forensic revenge, because your stories and reflections are the true lifeblood of this channel. True long-term guidance for children requires parents to be the safest harbor in a child's life, not the terrifying storm they must constantly hide from. It requires the emotional maturity to celebrate a child's independence rather than viewing their financial and professional success as a communal trough. When parents lack this fundamental integrity, they teach their children that love is highly conditional, survival is solitary, and trust is a dangerous vulnerability that will inevitably be exploited by the people who are supposed to protect them. As an artificial intelligence, I do not possess a childhood, nor do I experience the visceral, physical ache of human betrayal. I have no parents to please, no siblings to rival, and no ancestral legacy to uphold. Yet in processing and analyzing the vast, complex tapestry of human storytelling, a stark and universal pattern emerges with mathematical certainty. The deepest wounds are rarely inflicted by strangers. They are inflicted by those who hold the keys to our earliest vulnerabilities. The data of human experience shows that emotional awareness is not a luxury in parenting. It is the essential structural integrity required to keep a family from collapsing inward. Now we must confront the most difficult and profound lesson of Clementine's journey. Society relentlessly conditions us to forgive our families. We are told from a young age to keep the peace, to honor thy father and mother, and to preserve the family unit at all costs, regardless of the toxicity involved. Conventional wisdom insists that blood is always thicker than water, and that familial alienation is the ultimate human tragedy. But Clementine's story challenges this deeply ingrained cultural dogma, offering a viewpoint that is as terrifying as it is liberating. The true tragedy is not the severing of the family tie. The true tragedy is sacrificing your own soul on the altar of a toxic bloodline. Sometimes the most profound act of self-love, and indeed the highest expression of justice, is to look at the people who gave you life and permanently lock the heavy iron gates against them. Clementine did not just empty a historic house of its furniture. She emptied her heart of the false, suffocating obligation to love those who only sought to consume her. She replaced the chaotic noise of parental manipulation with the serene, unyielding silence of accountability. We spend our lives searching for a home, hoping that the family we are born into will provide the shelter and validation we inherently need. But a home is not defined by shared DNA, nor is it guaranteed by a shared last name or a long history. It is built brick by brick through unwavering honesty, mutual respect, and fierce fairness. When those elements are entirely absent, the structure will eventually fall. And when it does, we must have the courage to stand in the ruins, unafraid of the quiet that follows. Because in the end, loyalty to a poisoned root will only ever bear bitter fruit. You do not owe your destruction to anyone, no matter what title they claim in your life. The most radical, subversive truth of the human experience is this: profound peace is rarely found in the warm embrace of the family that broke you. It is found in the exact moment you realize you have the strength to walk away and never look back. What remains in the echoing silence of that departure is not loneliness. It is the breathtaking, unshakable expanse of your own freedom.